Chapter 532. For the herders of the plains, the harder their lives were, the more they feared the world, and thought that there were gods in the world. As long as it was an enormous mountain and glacier that seemed insurmountable in their eyes, they thought they were the residences of gods. The continuous snowy plains behind the glacier were naturally the heavens. These glacier mountains on the northwest border of Donghu were thousands of miles wide. Even the highland pastures under these mountains were taller than many other mountains in the world. When these Wuji wolves pulling the carriages could not move forward, the primal energies of the universe were so thin that ordinary people could not move. Between two almost straight snowy peaks was a glacier that stretched out like a demon's tongue. The surface had been corroded to a blue-black color by the wind, and the dust embedded in the ice was like rust. Ding Ning slowly walked on the glacier, holding the old monk's wooden staff. He was not walking slowly because he wanted to see the scenery, but because it was truly difficult. Even a Realm 7 cultivator, at this height where they could not breathe normally, needed to use up the primal energies of the universe stored in their bodies to maintain their consumption. While he had used the spirit rain that the 9-death silkworm had swallowed into the ancestral mountain, and the help of the heaven-replenishing divine art and the human sovereign jade annulus, he had silently reached Realm 6 second class and obtained the comprehension of Void Realm. He had found a shortcut to occasionally use Realm 7 power, but his present state was not true Realm 7. Even if he was just returning to the path he had already taken, those great barriers to cultivators did not exist for him. The true realm he had once reached was far beyond Realm 7, but his body could not keep up. He was not even comparable to those cultivators in Chongling who had slowly cultivated to Realm 6 after countless years. His breathing was as heavy as bellows, but his body still could not get enough air. His face grew redder, his lips turned purple, and his head started to swell with pain. But his resolve was extraordinary and unimaginable to most present cultivators. So when he walked in a place like this, he only needed to borrow a staff from the old monk behind him to maintain his clarity. The old monk walked next to Ding Ning and Zhongsun Qinxue like an attendant. He was even barefoot. His feet and legs did not seem to have much flesh and blood, and were completely black. But they contained an indescribable power, as though he could break the glacier with a stomp. This kind of glacier contained countless dangers. Below the seemingly ordinary flat ground, there were sometimes thin ice shells that covered the bottomless, terrifying ice cracks. Therefore, his attention was always highly focused. However, as the trek began, a look of surprise gradually appeared in his eyes. He could sense that Zhongsun Qinxue was also a Realm 7 cultivator and far stronger than ordinary Realm 7s. Yet to his surprise, Zhongsun Qinxue seemed to have an easier time walking in a place like this than him. His vital energy cultivation was slightly weaker than his, and he cultivated the tantric ascetic method. His body looked like it had been squeezed dry by the minimal requirements, but every tiny particle of energy and blood, every bit of flesh and blood in his body had been stimulated to the greatest potential, and he had reached a level of coordination that other cultivators could not imagine. Therefore, not only did his body contain a terrifying amount of physical strength, every movement he made also consumed far less energy than cultivators of the same level. It was not just the consumption of primal energies of the universe, but mental, physical, heat, and even the need for water and air. His consumption was much lower than cultivators of the same level. He had only gone to Chongling once in his life, and spent the rest of his time in seclusion and cultivation. So he did not know Zhongsun Qinxue's origins. He only knew that she was able to walk more easily than him in this kind of environment. This meant that the life bond item in this female cultivator's body was the king of this icy world. It was extremely strong, and was far more sensitive to the primal energies of the universe in this kind of place than ordinary life bond items. He should be the cultivator most suited to walking in this kind of place. Now, with this powerful female cultivator even stronger than him, this old monk had a feeling that if the three of them could not get the sword hidden in the Lingshu sword gate, no one in the world could find this sword. Yet in this moment, he, Zhongsun Qinxue, and Ding Ning all sensed a threat of danger at the same time. In the glacier in front of him, which had been cut into pieces by nature, a few strange cold currents suddenly surged. Several cold lights with strange whistling sounds, like the cries of ghosts, instantly magnified in the eyes of the three people. This rush of time felt very long in the old monk's perception. These were 5 arrows. They were extremely thin, but regardless of whether it was the tail feathers or the shaft, they were all made of metal. There were runes carved from the arrowhead to the tail feathers. These simple runes made these arrows even faster than the flying swords of ordinary cultivators. The old monk's wooden staff was in Ding Ning's hands, but he naturally could deal with these 5 arrows. So he reached out with his right hand, and his 5 fingers flicked a few times. Numerous specks of snow sand in the air were flicked out by his fingers, and then turned into snow dust with terrifying power that hit the 5 arrows. These 5 metal arrows suddenly paused, and then gave off a terrifying explosion in the air. Then these arrows were shattered into countless pieces and flew back at a speed even greater than the previous arrows. Behind those stone forest-like glaciers, the silhouettes of several people could be vaguely seen. They held longbows that also gave off a strange feeling. However, before they could fire a second arrow, their bodies were pierced by countless metal fragments that flew backwards. These metal shards, carrying the hot blood in their bodies, shot into the glacier behind them, and each piece caused an enormous explosion. The huge shockwave from the explosion threw the archers who were still sputtering blood into the air. When Ding Ning narrowed his eyes, these archers landed in front of him like falling rocks. Being able to knock the assassins to the ground with a flick of his finger was enough to make people feel that this old monk's cultivation was terrifying. But these archers were already in tatters and unable to move, yet they were not dead. This showed the old monk's terrifying state. Ding Ning leaned forward slightly, wanting to see the attire and other details of these archers. But in this moment, these archers' throats made soft sounds and black blood gushed out at the same time. A strong stench charged out, and these archers stopped breathing at the same time. Chapter 533. This stench was the typical smell of black belly poison. Black belly poison came from a mixture of the venom of a kind of snake in the mountains and many kinds of poisonous grasses. The poison was extremely strong. Cultivators below Realm 7 would almost immediately die from the poison. Even the best doctor would not be able to save them in time. Because that kind of viper was relatively rare. Although this kind of poison was famous for its tyrannical nature, it had not reached the point where many people could afford to use it. It was also not monopolized by a certain place or a certain influential family, so it could not become the symbol of a certain power. These 5 archers had attacked with a vicious presence of battle experience. In a situation like this, they were still able to use the flesh and blood in their throats to crush the poison hidden in their throats and commit suicide. These were clearly death soldiers. Since they were death soldiers, there could not be many of them. But these 5 people, even when they committed suicide, were uniform in their actions and presence. They gave off the feeling of Ding Ning's army. Who are these people? Zhang Sun Qinxue frowned as she looked at the black blood seeping out of the 5 archers' mouths and asked, "I can't see right now." Ding Ning shook his head. These arrows and longbows appear to be Chu weapons. Chu people? Zhang Sun Qinxue naturally understood Ding Ning's meaning. At this time, other than the bows and arrows, these 5 archers did not have anything special that represented their identity. But even if they were sure that these bows and arrows were seal weapons of the Chu dynasty, it was not enough to prove that these people were Chu people. But the Qin dynasty was too far from here, and the Chu people were the most suspicious. There are flying swords. The old monk also frowned. As he spoke, Zhang Sun Qinxue and Ding Ning sensed several clear and sinister scents at the same time. Zhang Sun Qinxue did not move. Ding Ning very naturally handed the wooden staff back to the old monk. Then, this wooden staff that had passed through the hands of several generations of ascetics and was covered in a thick layer of greasy mud seemed to have become one with the old monk's body, becoming an arm of his. The old monk swung his staff smoothly into the ice beneath his feet. A small gray sword that was like a poisonous snake was struck by the wooden staff and jumped up. With a light cracking sound, The small gray sword dimmed and fell to the ground as if it had lost its life. The old monk's wooden staff pierced into the ice below. A rumbling sound came from the inside of the glacier, as if a giant python was slithering through. The blue-black ice in front of the three people could be seen with the naked eye exploding layer by layer, and a terrifying wave of air was moving forward. With a soft sound, a small transparent sword broke through the ice at an extremely fast speed. However, it was still hit by the air wave behind it. It was instantly catapulted into the air and lost control. Two muffled groans came from above, followed by two gusts of wind. The old monk's staff was still stuck in the ice, but as he lifted it, it was as if countless pieces of ice and snow were about to fly out of the hole he had pierced. At the same time, his right foot naturally lifted and he was about to step forward. But at this time, Ding Ning shook his head and said, "Do not chase." The wind and thunder under the old monk's feet naturally disappeared. His right foot landed, and the flying ice and snow under the wooden staff suddenly calmed down. The two escaping gusts of wind had not disappeared, but when Zhang Sun Qinxue looked up, a blinding ball of fire appeared in the blue-black ice. In the next moment, a thunderous roar came from the fire. The world suddenly shook. Beneath the two retreating cultivators, the glacier several hundred meters in radius directly exploded. The violent explosion directly tore the bodies of the two cultivators into pieces without any reason. Then, the shock wave expanded outwards and shook the valley, causing large avalanches on the surrounding slopes. Including the glacier where Ding Ning and the others were, the falling snow and enormous pieces of ice that fell from the cliffs on both sides surged down like an army. The old monk's gaze focused slightly. The wooden staff stabbed forward. Before the falling snow arrived, the wild wind was split in half by the powerful force. Zhang Sun Qinxue did not move. She could deal with an avalanche like this, so the old monk could do the same. She turned to look at Ding Ning. Ding Ning and her had a tacit understanding and knew her doubts. He glanced at her and said easily, "No cultivator is an idiot." These two swordsmen dared to attack after seeing the monk's cultivation. There must be a problem. The ice and snow had passed. The old monk stood motionless. A glowing light in front of the wooden staff split the ice and snow like a sharp blade. Enormous waves of ice and snow roiled on both sides, shaking the world. But an explosion like that cannot harm him, Zhang Sun Qinxue said. Ding Ning looked at her and said, "Cultivators below Realm 7 cannot walk here. An ambush like this is not enough to kill a powerful Realm 7. There is only one possibility. An ambush like this is used to waste the vital energy of powerful cultivators who come here. Walking in a place like this, it is hard to replenish the vital energy and stamina used up." Ding Ning thought and rubbed his aching head. Then he said, "Using life to waste the power of powerful cultivators and then winning in the end is the most common tactic used by armies. But to use two Realm 5 swordsmen at the start to waste the power of powerful cultivators, this kind of commander and army must be monstrous." Zhang Sun Qinxue thought of the two swordsmen who had been torn apart in the explosion just now. Her expression was unnatural and filled with disgust. "Whose army is this?" "I do not know." Ding Ning shook his head honestly. "I have not led an army for many years. The difference between the past and present is great. But since this is an army, and an army like this, it will not be as easy to get this sword as we imagined." Zhang Sun Qinxue frowned. Just these 5 archers, 2 swordsmen, and an explosion were enough for Ding Ning to confirm that this was a powerful army. This was not enough proof in the eyes of other people, but she knew what kind of experience Ding Ning had, so she did not have to doubt it. The avalanche came quickly and left quickly. After the enormous wave of ice and snow, there were countless threads of ice and snow flying in the air. Zhang Sun Qinxue slowly looked up. On a flat part of the glacier above, there was an enormous black shadow standing silently in the mist of snow. This was a group of beasts that looked like giant lizards, many times larger than yaks, and covered in thick black hair. These enormous beasts had black metal chains wrapped around their necks. One end of the chains was in the hands of the riders on the backs of these beasts. These knights were wearing black leather armor with brown cotton robes underneath. Their heads and faces were also wrapped in brown cotton cloth. Since it is a battle of attrition, we have to use the most energy-efficient method. Ding Ning turned to look at the old monk and Zhang Sun Qinxue as he spoke slowly. Chapter 534. Zhang Sun Qinxue frowned slightly. She was a true daughter of a noble family, the daughter of the former most powerful Gongsun family of Chongling. Before the rise of the Bazin Kendo ground, the Jiaodong Commandery's Zheng family was like carrying the Gongsun family's shoes in the eyes of the people of Chongling. Women from noble families like her were strictly taught their manners and etiquette. What they heard and saw were different from ordinary women, and they usually did not show their emotions. Her slight frown usually represented disgust, but at this time, it was seriousness. In this high ground where the primal energies of the universe were thin, cultivators below Realm 7 found it difficult to breathe and used up their energy quickly. Most likely, after walking for many hours in this place, their energy would be used up. Adding on the extreme cold, they could not replenish their energy and could freeze to death. Previously, when the 5 archers and 2 swordsmen had set up an ambush here, she had been puzzled. Just walking here and setting up an ambush would make it difficult for these cultivators to be in perfect condition. Now, seeing these enormous beasts standing in the wind, she immediately had an answer. These were Shueho. In many storybooks of Chongling, they were creatures similar to giant apes. But in reality, these enormous beasts lived along the coast of the North Sea and were snow beasts similar to leopards. These snow beasts lived in groups, were astounding in speed, and had great strength and endurance. At this moment, at a glance, there were at least 100 snow ho that had appeared in the snow. With these huge beasts as mounts and towing beasts, they did not need to expend much physical strength to move through this place. For example, moving tents could even drag enough food and military equipment. Even more importantly, what kind of army could possess so many powerful beasts? As the daughter of a former powerful family, she knew that the expenditure to maintain so many beasts was astounding. From this, she could infer that the organization of this army was astounding and would not be as simple as an ordinary army of 10,000 people with a few dozen Realm 5 cultivators at most. Ding Ning raised his head and remained silent. The ice and snow pellets hit his face, giving him a needle-like feeling, causing him to unconsciously narrow his eyes slightly. In his memory, there was no army like this that used the snow hoe as mounts. However, the strength of the army in front of him was unquestionable, especially the coldness and indifference of this army in the face of death. This made him understand that there were no tricks to deal with this kind of army, unless the other's commander appeared and was killed by them. However, he had a strong intuition that the commander of this army would only appear at the last moment when it was possible to kill them. This was because in the battles he had experienced in the past, he had encountered many such commanders. In order to achieve his goal, he was willing to pay any price, even his own life. A strange look appeared in the depths of the old monk's eyes. His cultivation method was special, so he knew better than any other cultivator about the loss of strength and vital energy. In his eyes, the opponents that appeared right now were pitifully weak. There was not much difference whether they resisted or not. But in a place like this, even if these people lined up in front of him to be beaten to death, he would have to pay a portion of his strength and vital energy as the price. At this time, high up in the desolate Donghu border glaciers, as these snow ho and their riders appeared, the first scene that appeared in his mind was the past Chongling. He thought of Wang Jingming. He thought of the mountains of corpses, the armies loyal to Yuanwu and Zhengxiu, the countless cultivators from all the dynasties in the world. No one could withstand Wang Jingming's casual blow. But even so, Wang Jingming's footsteps were blocked in that alley. Even though the corpses of the experts he had killed were piled up like mountains, he was still unable to advance much. Now Wang Jingming seemed to have become him. This was the feeling that the army in front of him naturally gave him. However, this scene only appeared in his mind for a short moment. In the next moment, he took a step forward and stood in front of Ding Ning and Zhongsun Qinxue. His movements were extremely natural and even gave people a strange sense of beauty. His feet landed on the snow and did not even cause a snowflake to fly. The ice in front of him suddenly shook violently. The thick snow caused by the avalanche surged like waves and charged down. The snow hoe above had already begun to attack under the urging of the riders on their backs. It was as if they were driving a huge wave of snow as they rushed down. No one moved. Ding Ning and Zhongsun Qinxue looked calmly at the waves of snow and the charging black shadows. When the waves reached the old monk at the front, the old monk looked up and stabbed with his wooden staff. With a hiss, the wooden staff parted the waves of snow ahead and tapped the forehead of a snow hoe coming through the air. Compared to him, Schweb-Er's figure was like a small hill. When this wooden staff touched its forehead, between its eyes, it was so small that it was like a straw was inserted into its forehead. However, this seemingly gentle stab of the wooden staff easily killed this snow hoe. Like welcoming the most natural death, this snow hoe that had been fierce a breath ago naturally died. From its forehead to the depths of its body, it seemed to stop like a chain reaction. The snow hoe that was struck in the forehead died instantly. However, its body began to violently shake due to a type of strange twitching. When its body jumped even higher, its entire body even released a pah sound, flinging away the knight holding a long and sharp bronze spear on its back. The old monk maintained his gentle stabbing posture. The snow hoe was high above his head, and the rider on its back was falling. The scene in this moment gave people the feeling that the old monk had forcefully lifted the heavy snow hoe off his head. Accompanied by a terrifying howl, dozens of shadows fell towards the old monk and Ding Ning, Zhongsun Qinxue behind him. Each shadow was either the claws and fangs of the giant beasts, or the spears of the riders, or the bolts fired from the seal weapons of the riders behind them. There were even flying swords mixed in. As these dozens of shadows fell, the dim light in the snow grew even darker, and the sky seemed to be covered. Yet the old monk's movements were still simple. His wooden staff continued to stab forward. His movements did not seem to be fast. It even gave people the feeling that each of these shadows was faster than him. Yet as he continued to stab, these shadows disappeared one by one. The snow hoe and riders were thrown into the air. A storm swept past. More than 20 snow hoe and their riders fell to the ground one after another. Seeing this scene, the riders on the backs of the remaining snow hoe that passed by him, Ding Ning and Zhongsun Qinshue's sides could not help but have their calm eyes filled with terror. Ding Ning's eyebrows rose slightly. He smelled a familiar presence in the stench of blood in the surroundings. This was the smell of a kind of medicinal herb with a strong, earthy smell. But then the earthy smell turned into a strong, sweet fragrance. Dragon blood grass. He turned to look at Zhongsun Qinxue next to him and nodded. He said with certainty, "It is the army from Chu." Chapter 535. In the past, among the elite armies of the Yu dynasty, there was a kind of pill called the marching pill. Although the name of this pill sounded ordinary, the actual effect was very terrifying. The soldiers who took this pill had astounding increases in strength and endurance. They could even go days without sleep and rest, and be in an excited state. In such a state, the army of the Yu dynasty could enter the battlefield ahead of the enemy's expectations, especially if the enemy was not a match, and the elite army of the Yu dynasty chased. No enemy could escape. In the next few days, even the remnants of the enemy would be killed, completely uprooted. After the Yu dynasty was destroyed, the recipe for this kind of marching pill was lost, but the Chu dynasty had successfully found one of the main ingredients, the dragon blood grass. The effects of the dragon blood grass were not as astounding as the marching pill, but it could stimulate the potential of the body for a few days. This dragon blood grass was a great secret to the Chu dynasty, and only came from the imperial family. The outside world did not know where the dragon blood grass came from, how to cultivate it, or how much existed in the world. Even though Ding Ning knew that Li Lingjun and Zheng Xiu had some kind of secret agreement, the true controller of the Chu dynasty was his mother consort Zhao. The army of the Qin dynasty could not silently cross the Donghu and Chu borders and come here, much less receive the support of large amounts of secret medicine. He had experience and intuition that other cultivators could not compare to regarding armies in war. He was certain that this was an army from the Chu dynasty. The key was why this army could appear here against Consort Zhao's support, and why this army was so determined to fight to the death against the cultivators who came here. Other than the few people he trusted, everyone else in the world thought he was dead. Zhangsun Qinxue had not acted at all. He and Zhangsun Qinxue had changed into thick furs, and their faces were covered with thick scarves. When they arrived, this army could only guess the identity of this old monk. The old monk had killed the Donghu emperor and caused Donghu and Wuji to ally. He naturally stood against the Qin dynasty. Then what kind of Chu army would want to kill such a sadhu? These were all perplexing questions, but they seemed to be meaningless at the moment. The remaining snow ho that had just charged past them on both sides had already charged back. The old monk did not hesitate. He raised the wooden staff in his hand and stabbed it in all directions. Whether it was the snow ho's claws, body, or the falling arrows and weapons, in his perception, in the end, they only became shadows of different thickness, fast or slow. His wooden staff swam through the shadows, and with every strike, the shadow closest to him and Ding Ning would disappear. There weren't many sounds of violent impacts and collisions. Only the sound of air leaking could be heard in the air. The sound came from the blood gushing out from the holes made by the wooden staff. The boiling blood often froze into ice beads when it hit the ground, and the riders and the snow spaniels who were sent flying also began to rapidly turn cold when they hit the ground. This scene was very calm. The old monk's actions caused Zhangsun Qinxue to think of farmers planting rice in the paddy fields of Chongling. But this monotonous and tedious scene of repeated killing caused Zhangsun Qinxue to feel slightly disgusted. Monotonous but very efficient. The farming of Chongling's farmers was like this. This old monk's killing was also very efficient. There was an ice cave on a distant glacier. There was an army stationed in the ice cave. From the entrance of the cave to the depths of the ice cave where no light could be seen, it was densely packed. It was unknown how many people there were. Yet these people all had silent presences and did not even make a sound when they breathed. They were like ghosts living here. There was a general at the cave entrance, dressed in black robes that did not reflect light. He narrowed his eyes and looked down at the old monk's killing from a distance. But the old monk, Ding Ning, and the others did not sense anything. He stood at the entrance of the ice cave like a barrier. Even the presence of the army inside the cave could not spread out. The old monk panted slightly. The efficient killing was very fast. All the snow ho and the riders on their backs had died, and then were quickly frozen into ice sculptures. The bright red blood on the blue-black surface of the glacier was like an eerie flower blooming. It appeared for a moment, and then quickly dimmed into a shocking purple-black color. Yet the old monk could not help but feel a thread of tiredness. Killing people was like planting rice. The farmers of Chongling would not be tired after planting a bunch of rice, but after a row of paddy fields, any farmer would be tired. No one is invincible. He shook his head softly, turned around, and looked at Ding Ning with a complicated gaze. The old monk was thinking of the battle he had seen in Chongling back then. That battle in Chongling had many profound meanings for the entire world of cultivators. For the cultivators of this era, many of the differences in cultivation only existed in the records. When Wang Jingming fought his way into Chongling, many cultivators saw how great the difference in power was between the realms. But for the entire world of cultivators, the most profound meaning was this battle showed everyone in the world that even the truly invincible cultivators in the world of cultivators could be entangled and killed. Before this, countless powerful cultivators had died at the hands of the army and the cultivators. But no one knew if a truly invincible cultivator could be killed. The deaths of those peerless experts were usually due to the appearance of new experts, and not by a group of cultivators with great power differences. So from a certain point of view, That battle was a gamble between Yuanwu and Zheng Xiu. They gambled on whether they could stop and kill an invincible cultivator. The result of that battle brought many bad results to the world of cultivators. Ding Ning and Zhang Sun Qinxue understood the meaning of his words and his emotions. But Ding Ning looked calmly at the old monk and shook his head seriously. He said, "To be killed like that means one is not truly invincible." The old monk suddenly shook. At the Deer Mountain Conference, Yuanwu only proved one thing. Realm 8 is not invincible. Ding Ning continued, Realm 8 is not invincible. One needs Realm 9. True invincibility is not in how high one's cultivation is, but how high one surpasses all the people in the world, all the cultivators. The old monk had comprehended, but when he heard this, he still could not help but be stunned. A moment later, he looked respectfully at Ding Ning and asked, "In the past, I heard people say that your initial goal was to become the first sword of the world. The first sword of the world you speak of is to surpass everyone in the world, and millions of people cannot kill you?" Ding Ning nodded and said, "That is the true first sword of the world." The old monk was silent for a moment and said, "But later, I heard you changed your mind. At that time, I was young and arrogant. I felt I surpassed everyone in the world. It was easy to conquer the world, but difficult to unify the world. But in the end, it was a young and immature idea. In the end, I returned to my old path." Ding Ning sighed softly and said. Chapter 536. The old monk thought and said, "In the past, it was easy for you to become the first sword of the world, but now, it is difficult to become the first sword of the world." Ding Ning nodded. He could understand the old monk's meaning. But the old monk feared that Ding Ning would misunderstand and said, "It is not that you need to recover your cultivation now. Many cultivators are ahead of you. The key is that you have created an era. You and the Ba Mountain Sword Field have pushed the cultivation of the entire cultivation world a step forward." The old monk's reasoning was great, but in reality, it was very simple. For example, in a sect, there were Realm 4 and 5 cultivators. There were almost no Realm 6 and 7 cultivators. But when a group of Realm 7 Grandmasters suddenly appeared, the overall cultivation of the sect, including Realm 5 and 6 cultivators, would naturally increase in the next period. This was the reality. Multiple great Grandmasters could often affect the rise and fall of an era. Wang Jingming and the Bazin Kendo ground had risen when the cultivation world was declining. At that time, there were very few Realm 6 and 7 cultivators. But now, Ding Ning was in the era after the Bazin Kendo ground. Many sects had risen. For example, in Yi Sealing's generation, many people who had been deeply influenced by the Bazin Kendo ground had become Grandmasters. If there was a battle like that many years later, facing more Grandmasters and even new Realm 8 cultivators other than Yuanwu, what kind of cultivation was needed to truly win and become the invincible that Ding Ning spoke of? This was a question that the old monk was very interested in. So he thought and asked respectfully, "Have you reached Yuanwu's realm?" "In the past, in Chongling, I was between Realm 7 and 8. I had some misgivings about some things and did not understand them completely. So I stayed between the crossing and not crossing. My cultivation was just slightly ahead of you now." Ding Ning looked at the old monk and said calmly, "Later on, I spent more than a decade in Chongling, repeating some of the paths I walked, and even correcting some of the mistakes I made in my past cultivation. Those were actually very simple and did not require much thought. What I considered was the problem between Realm 7 and 8. In terms of cultivation, I'm naturally several steps above Yuanwu." The old monk stilled and then laughed self-deprecatingly. "I was foolish to ask such a question. In the past, you were far ahead of Yuanwu. Even if you were behind him for many years in terms of cultivation, you were far ahead of him." Ding Ning looked at him and said seriously, "Cultivation state alone is not enough." The old monk thought about the purpose of coming to this mountain and looked at the wooden staff in his hand. He came to a complete realization and said, "There is also the body and the weapon and the accumulation of time." Ding Ning also looked at the wooden staff in the old monk's hand. The wooden staff had been soaked in blood for a long time. At this moment, the oily surface of the staff had lost quite a bit of its dull luster, revealing a layer of amber-like bone luster within. Then he nodded and didn't say anything. "I want to serve you by your side." The old monk bowed slightly and bowed to Ding Ning with the etiquette of Chongling. He said solemnly, "Only you in the world have the possibility of becoming the first sword of the world." His skin was purplish-black, but when he spoke, his skin shone with a faint golden light under the sunlight. Although the yuan qi of heaven and earth in this area was extremely thin, it naturally changed. From time to time, there would be holy light pillars falling from the sky. In the distant ice cave, the general who stood like a ghost and watched the old monk quietly had a look of shock in his eyes for the first time. Because he was too far away, he could not hear the conversation between the old monk and Ding Ning and the others. He did not know who Ding Ning and Zhongsun Qinxue were. However, it was clear that after the old monk killed the Snow Ho cavalry, he had a conversation with the young man. With just a few words, the old monk had an inexplicable enlightenment. He was actually about to succeed in breaking through the realm. He was about to take the last step and truly enter the 8th realm. This general knew that cultivators could change their appearance and even their physique. Looking young did not mean they were truly young. But putting aside the question of age, what kind of cultivator could, with just a few words and actions, be of great help to this ascetic monk in his breakthrough? Ding Ning looked calmly at the old monk. Previously, many of his enemies hated his calmness, but they did not know where his presence came from. Previously, this old monk had said something similar to serving, but he knew that the old monk's meaning was very different now. The old monk was certain that only he could surpass all the cultivators in the world and be truly invincible. Therefore, his words were an oath. He wanted to serve Ding Ning until Ding Ning reached that level. Such an oath meant that the meaning of his life in the future was to protect Ding Ning until he reached that level. That was a level he could not reach himself, but wanted to see. This was not hard for Zhongsun Qinxue to understand at this time. The old monk pursued his entire life just to see a higher level, regardless of whether he reached it or he could see others reach it with his own eyes. This old monk was a true cultivation maniac. He only worried that Ding Ning would not need him to serve him in the future. The world was filled with maniacs. What was different was the maniacs. Looking at the faint golden light coming off the old monk's skin, and sensing that this was not coming from the old monk's body, but from thin primal energies of the universe gathering over and colliding with the light coming from his body, Zhongsun Qinxue took a deep breath and turned to look at Ding Ning. So the key to breaking through from Realm 7 to Realm 8 is the same as the beginning of cultivation, not to absorb, but to release. This was a rare opportunity. It was not just related to the old monk's cultivation. For Ding Ning, this was an opportunity he had never experienced before. After all, in his cultivation experience, he had not truly taken the last step of breaking through Realm 7 and 8 because of his doubts. The old monk's state of being close to a breakthrough was a kind of confirmation. So Ding Ning was also very serious and said slowly, "It is to release and to not solidify oneself. There is no construction without destruction." These words were unusually profound for ordinary cultivators, but even Zhongsun Qinxue was not far from Realm 8, so she understood. Dispersing cultivation? She frowned and simply spat out these two words. "I fear that this is how Realm 7 will end up in Realm 8. Destroy all cultivation, empty one's mind and body, and you will naturally lead to a new world. Without destruction, there is no construction." Ding Ning looked at her and the old monk and said with slight bitterness, "In the past, I did not understand one thing. I was worried that this was a cycle. While there were Realm 8 cultivators in the records, and even Realm 9, in our time, no one could truly enter Realm 8. Even the generation before us did not have any cultivators. No one had seen it with their own eyes. So I was worried that this was a natural cycle at the end of cultivation, like birth, old age, sickness, and death. Dissipating cultivation in Realm 8 is starting over. After all, many of the stories in the ancient books were lies. Another thing I was worried about was that vital energy can be dissipated, the body can be emptied, but how can one's mind be emptied? Zhang Sun Qinxue listened intently. She did not have any questions. She knew that Wang Jingmeng had surpassed the cultivators of the present because he was too good at questioning and creating his own path. Reality proved that many of the cultivation methods in the records were not the best. Many of the truths and stories were lies. Ding Ning looked up slightly and took a deep breath. He said slowly, "Later I thought it through. The so-called release of the mind is the deepest obsession. Invisible things are just like tangible things. They have some kind of deepest obsession. It is like the mind is not open enough, and the mind is condensed to one point. Just like how if our vital energy is condensed to one point, our meridians are empty. So many of the stories in the records are lies." Zhang Sun Qinxue completely understood. She looked at Ding Ning, whose brows were filled with sorrow and emotion. So it is not the kind of cultivators who are especially open-minded and care about the people of the world who can go from Realm 7 to Realm 8. It is cultivators who are especially obsessed with one thing that can truly break through Realm 7 to Realm 8, or even extremely narrow-minded people. Very simple, this is the ultimate truth. Ding Ning grimaced. Who can be truly benevolent and selfless? But it is even simpler to be extremely narrow-minded, selfish, and greedy. There are no truly benevolent people in the world, but there are truly obsessed people, regardless of what they are obsessed with, Ding Ning added as he looked at her. Let's go. Zhang Sun Qinxue did not speak more. She nodded and then said, I will lead the way. Ding Ning looked in surprise at her. Zhang Sun Qinxue said, the glaciers here have never melted. There will naturally be traces where cultivators have passed. Some traces are new, some old. Ding Ning immediately understood. The Nine-Hell King sword had a natural reaction to the cold energies of the world. Even though the traces of the great Grandmaster of Lingshu's sword gate had been covered by the wind, snow, and time, if Zhang Sun Qinxue said she could find it, then she could sense it. He and Zhang Sun Qinxue were not worried about this army that inexplicably existed here. Regardless of whether the other's target was the old monk or the sword, whether they went first or not would not change the situation. The three started walking. The wooden staff was still in Ding Ning's hands. The old monk still walked at the front. While his strongest perception was in his body and not in the ice and snow, his cultivation had reached the border between Realm 7 and 8. He was in an indescribable state and seemed to be able to sense where Zhang Sun Qinxue's gaze and thoughts were. So it seemed that he was still leading the way. Zhang Sun Qinxue could understand the barrier between Realm 7 and 8. When one's vital energy reached the final barrier, what one needed to search for was that obsession. For him, there were no good or bad people in the world, only people with different goals. Chapter 537. In Chongling, it was so dark that one could not see one's hand. Yet between these glaciers, the sun seemed to never set. Being able to capture some of the presence left behind by the cultivator of Lingshu's sword gate did not mean that one could grasp it accurately at all times. Zhang Sun Qinxue spent a long time. When the sun that seemed to never set was about to disappear from the horizon behind the glaciers, she looked ahead and suddenly smiled. She rarely smiled. Although her smile was extremely reserved, the meaning behind her smile at this time was unusual. Ding Ning had felt several times he was about to fall asleep. Every time he felt extremely sleepy and his body was about to lose consciousness, the countless invisible silkworms in his body would become active and spit out vital chi to wake him up again. But the nine-death silkworm hiding in his body could not endlessly release energy. From Chongling to now, he had accumulated energy for many years, especially the pure spirit energy he had absorbed in the spirit rain in the ancestral lands. It had almost all been used up in his previous breakthrough. Even more importantly, most of the nine-death silkworm's power in his body was suppressing the medicinal power of the elixir of life. Because of the addition of that strange army, it would not be an easy path to get that sword. So when he saw Zhang Sun Qinxue's reserved smile, he sighed in relief and asked softly, Almost there? Zhang Sun Qinshue's gaze landed on the flat glaciers ahead. She nodded, and her smile widened. This elder of Lingshu Sword Gate is too secretive. I have searched for his presence for so long, but had not expected him to freeze this lake into a glacier in order to hide it. Ding Ning shook slightly and looked at the ice under his feet. There is a lake below? The ice is slightly thick, but there is a lake below. Zhang Sun Qinshue looked at him and said, "It is a hot lake." The old monk at the front hesitated for a moment. He used his wooden staff to stab at the ice. He did not seem to use much strength, but when he raised his staff, a vertical hole appeared in the ice. A wisp of white-hot air gushed out like a fountain. Then the heat quickly disappeared. The hole was naturally sealed by the condensed and frozen water vapor. There was a hot lake below. There was a hot lake at the top of such a cold glacier. This meant that the earth veins here, or rather, the power contained here was very different from other parts of the glacier. The cultivator of Lingshu Sword Gate used powerful methods to seal the surface of this hot lake with thick ice. He did not want people to discover the abnormality of this place. But for Zhang Sun Qinshue, who could track the presence he left behind, this was slightly ironic. He used such methods to seal the lake. The presence he left behind on the lake was extremely thick for Zhang Sun Qinshue, resonating with her life bond sword. It was like an enormous fire had been lit here. The three of them continued to walk along the frozen lake. At the other end of the lake, the presence that resonated with Zhang Sun Qinshue's life bond sword seemed to be the end of this journey. Tiny pieces of ice cracked under the soles of his feet, making creaking sounds. Although this sound was no different from walking in other places, Ding Ning still had a strange feeling when he thought that he was walking in a hot lake with a very high water temperature. This lake was vast. When the light was dim, one could not even see the middle of the lake from one end. When Ding Ning, Zhang Sun Qinshue, and the old monk's figures disappeared into the dim light at the center of the lake, many tall black figures slowly appeared at the edge of the lake. It was still the snow hoe. Even though the old monk had killed more than 50 snow hoe earlier, these rare and powerful snow beasts still appeared again. There were more than 200 snow hoe dragging all kinds of loads, surging like a tide across the edge of the lake, surging onto the ice surface that was unfathomably thick. There were cultivators wrapped in thick black cotton robes on these snow hoes' back and behind them. But what was even more spectacular and terrifying, even inconceivable, was that further behind these snow hoe groups, there was an army. This army had more than 300 people, all of them on foot, silent like ghosts. To be able to travel such a long distance in such a place, and not rely on the snow hoe, they most likely had Realm 6 cultivation at the very least. But there was no army in the world, and it was impossible for there to be an army with more than 300 cultivators above Realm 6. Even during the time of the Bazin Kendo ground, such an army did not exist. Since it could not exist, there was only one explanation. These soldiers on foot could not all be above Realm 6. They were not Realm 6, but they walked as though they were above Realm 6. This caused this silent army to appear more terrifying than the enormous snow hoe group ahead. True night came on the glacier. Just like how the sun gave people the feeling that it would never set, the darkness in this place often gave people the feeling that it was an eternal night that would never light up. The old monk stopped walking. Ding Ning and Zhang Sun Qinshue also stopped walking. They had not reached the other side of the lake, and were still a long way from the edge of the lake. But there was an icicle in front of them. This icicle was only 2 feet tall. Even on the flat surface of the lake, it did not seem out of place. But even Ding Ning and the old monk could clearly sense that this icicle had taken a long time to grow. Originally, this place had been flat, but that sword had cut off a certain flow of energy from below and forcibly connected this place to the formation in the Lingshu Sword Gate. The natural vibrations of energy caused the ice here to slowly bulge upwards and finally form this icicle. So this was the eye of the formation. That sword was the stabilizer of this place and was right below this icicle. Ding Ning slowly turned around and looked at the inky black lake behind him. The ice was trembling slightly. They had found the sword, and the army had followed them. Obviously, They didn't hide at all and had already launched an attack. After the initial probing and exhaustion, this army did not make another move. Only now did they make a decisive move. This meant that this army's goal was most likely the same as theirs, to find this sword. The cold wind blowing through the air suddenly started to collapse, and the thin air started to tremble. In the pitch-black night sky, a ball of dark green flame suddenly appeared. The dark green flame fell from the sky, dragging a long tail of flame behind it. However, because the air was too thin, it quickly extinguished. Therefore, this dark green flame was like the vertical eye of a moving demon king in the sky. The green flames reflected the ice on the surface of the lake, making it glitter like emeralds. Amidst the dark green flames, there were many cold, golden rays of light. This was the heavenly slaughter, a powerful seal weapon of the Chu dynasty. Its power was enough to cover hundreds of feet around the lake. On the surface of the sparkling green lake, the snow hoe that had already removed its burden turned into a huge black shadow, charging over with gusts of wild wind. Chapter 538. We need to destroy those seal weapons. Zhang Sun Qinxue frowned and looked behind the enormous black shadows. Most of the weights that the snow hoe had been dragging had been taken off and turned into seal weapons standing on the ice. The heavenly slaughter that turned the entire lake green was just one of them. The threat of these seal weapons was far greater than the enormous black shadows surging over the ice. No need. These people only have the ability to use these seal weapons once. Ding Ning turned to look at her and shook his head. They only want to use these seal weapons once. The old monk narrowed his eyes slightly and looked up at the green flames. Even though his eyes were green, he could still clearly judge which streams would pose a true threat to him. Ding Ning and Zhang Sun Qinxue. He raised the wooden staff in his hand and flicked it several times towards the sky. Pew 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 pew. Terrifying and muffled sounds of collisions sounded at the same time. The green flames that covered the sky and made it so that grandmasters above Realm 7 could not immediately charge out of their range turned into countless sparks as he flicked them. The rising sparks and the flames from the seal weapons collided again, creating all kinds of explosions in the sky. In a flash, they formed a terrifying river in the air, gathering flames of all kinds that could easily tear a person's body to pieces. These flames flickered and gave people a feeling of disillusionment. The old monk's face seemed to be disillusioned in the flames. In this moment, his movements paused for a moment. When Li Shixing had appeared in front of him with the letter, his stagnant cultivation had loosened. With each breath, he was in a wondrous state of continuous breakthroughs. At this time, he was infinitely close to the state Wang Jingming had been in when he had fought his way into Chongling. Time and space in his mind seemed to have been brought back to the past Chongling. Many scenes that were hard to remember charged into his world. There were countless swords and sword essences in these scenes. The clearest were Wang Jingming's simple and seemingly unreasonable sword essences. Just as his movements paused for a moment, a dark red flying sword broke through the air. The shadow of the flames on the flying sword was reflected on his forehead. Ding Ning coughed softly. His gaze naturally fell on the crimson flying sword. The wooden staff in the old monk's hand stopped in the air and followed Ding Ning's gaze with this light cough. The crimson flying sword trembled countless times in an extremely short period of time, changing into countless possible stabbing paths. The light and shadow on the edge of the sword even twisted together, like a crimson ball of thread. Yet, the old monk's staff seemed to have predicted the flying sword's next move. It did not even change the direction of its stab and easily hit the crimson flying sword that came first. With a pop, the vital energy on the crimson flying sword shot out. The vital energy of the master of the flying sword was forced out. This flying sword flew backwards and stabbed into the left shoulder of a rider charging on the back of a snow hoe. This rider was throwing a long spear with all his power. The flying sword pierced into the left shoulder of this rider. This rider flipped backwards and fell to the ground. His body was instantly trampled into blood by the snow hoe behind him. Meanwhile, the long spear in his hand was thrown out. It deviated from its direction, deeply piercing through a rider in front of him and the snow hoe beneath him, nailing them to the ice. A snow hoe at the back could not stop in time and crashed hard into the snow hoe that was nailed to the ice. There was a teeth-numbing sound of bones exploding. The rider above was thrown into the air like a stone. He encountered some of the flowing flames falling from the sky, and his body started to burn outwards. Ding Ning did not look at these scenes. His gaze landed on an empty spot in front of the old monk. The old monk's staff naturally pierced towards that direction. A thin gray flying sword appeared in the empty space. Like a moth darting into a flame, it crashed into the old monk's staff. The thin flying sword snapped in the middle into two uneven pieces and flew out. One of the pieces landed on a rider's neck and easily cut off the rider's head. Ding Ning still did not look in that direction. His gaze constantly fell on the old monk's surroundings, and the old monk's wooden staff fell along with his gaze. The movements of the staff were smooth and natural. The old monk's entire body, including his mind and perception, became unprecedentedly smooth. He had grasped the sword essence that Wang Jingming had used when he had fought his way into Chongling. It was the easiest and fastest way to kill, but he still found it hard to understand. When his staff followed Ding Ning's gaze again, he turned his head and asked in a respectful tone, "How can you be so fast?" True speed is not just the extreme speed that one's body and vital energy can reach. The speed of one's movements is also in following the direction of the primal energies of the universe around us. Moving with the wind is always faster than moving against it. Ding Ning looked away. He looked at the old monk's inquisitive eyes and said, "Moving with the wind is not just following the direction of the primal energies of the universe, but also following the direction of the other. Your speed and the other speed is true speed." The old monk understood and laughed. "So that is how it is?" Ding Ning also laughed. "The methods you cultivate are different. Your body cultivation method and the sword manual of the Bazin Kendo ground. Even Wang Jingming in the past was not as fast as you. Even if he is faster than you, he will not be as tall as you. This kind of sword intent, if one didn't reach such a cultivation level and have you guiding him like this. Otherwise, even if one knew this kind of principle, who could learn it? And who could use this kind of sword intent again?" The old monk bowed according to Chongling's etiquette before turning around. When he and Ding Ning finished their conversation and bowed, more than half of the approaching snow hoe had fallen. Ding Ning's gaze did not look around the old monk. The old monk did not need his guidance. While the old monk's staff appeared clear and did not give people the feeling of astounding speed, in reality, it was the fastest in the world. At the other side of the lake, the ghost-like army did not move. Even when all the snow hoe and their riders died and turned into ice sculptures, this army waited silently. When all the seal weapons dimmed and the frozen lake fell back into darkness, a deputy behind the general at the front of the army bowed deeply to the general and said softly, "No one can stop this monk's attack. So many people will die tonight, but it is all right, as long as General can live." Chapter 539. All of the snow hoe went from a frenzied charge to a stillness. The ice on the surface of the lake left behind countless craters in the flames of the seal weapons. The old monk's staff fell back to the ice. Because the tip of the staff had pierced through too much flesh in a short period of time, it was still hot due to the friction with the bones. When it touched the ice, it gave off a puff of white smoke. The old monk had received the true teachings of the Bazin Kendo ground of the past. His combat power had taken a great step towards the peak of the world. He was in a state of inexplicable joy and excitement. Yet at this time, he unconsciously frowned. A figure slowly walked out of the darkness and drifting ice shards in front of him. This person's face was covered by a thick black cloth. He carried two long swords on his back, one with a green hilt and the other with a red hilt. Both of them shone in the darkness and were even more eye-catching than the person himself. This person was the deputy general who had been standing next to the general at the front of the army. As this deputy general moved forward, that ghost-like army, including the general at the front and the soldiers behind him, still maintained absolute silence. Not a single person moved or made a sound. A soft clang was heard. The two long swords left their sheaths at the same time. The sword with the indigo hilt was red, and the sword with the red hilt was indigo. It was exceptionally eerie in the darkness. The deputy general crossed his hands and held his swords. His footsteps were silent, but they grew faster. The two swords quickly turned into two ribbons of light in the darkness. A hint of seriousness appeared on the old monk's brow. He took a step forward, raising his staff. His arm naturally extended perfectly straight, the wooden staff also instantly becoming a pure straight line, stabbing towards this deputy general's forehead. There was an explosion. The space between this deputy general's brows was easily penetrated, the power of the staff tip entering his skull. However, even though the staff tip that had just been cooled by the surface of ice left behind traces in this deputy general's eyes, the powerful pressure even making his pupils deform and sink inwards, this deputy general still didn't change his movements at all. He allowed the old monk to pierce through his glabella as he continued with his sword move. The wrinkles on the old monk's forehead deepened. He did not make any extra movements. With that soft explosion, the power coming from the tip of his staff cut off all of the deputy general's vitality. Yet, out of the corner of his eyes, he looked at the sides of his chest. 2 tears appeared on his greasy monk robes. Inside the tears was his purple-black, steel-like skin. There were 2 faint white marks on his skin. The tip of the staff left the deputy general's forehead and fell down. When the tip of the staff touched the ice, the deputy general's corpse fell backwards. The old monk looked forward. The ghostly army moved, but only one person moved. A cultivator dressed like the deputy general passed the leading general and walked along the path the deputy general had walked towards the old monk alone. The old monk's perception stretched endlessly along the ice. He didn't know anything about this army, and even more so couldn't deduce these people's military ranks. However, even the slightest difference in aura was already enough to tell him many things from his perception and this deputy general he had just killed. This deputy general he had just killed was the second in command of this ghostly army. While the fight with him in that moment had been calm, and there had not been any fierce energy clashes, this deputy general had been able to cut through his robes and leave marks on his body. But this result surpassed any expert he had encountered in the Donghu Palace. Also, he was stronger today than when he had gone to the Donghu Palace. The second in command of an army was far stronger than the powerful grandmasters in the Donghu Palace. This was enough to prove the strength of this army. But even more importantly, this deputy general had been the first to come to his death. He had used his death to open the way. Using death to open the way. Follow. Ding Ning's brow furrowed deeply. He had seen many armies, but he had never seen an army like this before. The old monk's emotions did not change. For him, the meaning of life was to become Ding Ning's servant. So when he faced an army like this, other than admiring the other's strength and viciousness, killing was no different from breaking open a biscuit and drinking a cup of tea. What he had to consider was how to reduce the damage the other could do to him and conserve as much energy as possible. Even the thin air resistance had become an important factor for him to consider at this moment. So he did not even move his finger. Only when the second person in this ghostly army came close to him did he raise his staff and stab out. The tip of the staff accurately stabbed at the other's heart. The power was between the cracks of the bones and pierced through the weakest flesh towards the other's heart. But just as the power entered, the cultivator in front of him disappeared. There was a muffled roar in the world. This cultivator's body exploded from the inside out. What this cultivator did was walk in front of the old monk. Before the old monk could kill him, he exploded all the vital energy and primal energies of the universe he had accumulated in his body. The old monk's body gave off many popping sounds. It was like stone hitting fragile window paper. His monk robes had many more holes. Inside the holes, there were many more marks on his purple-black skin. Zhang Sun Qinshue's breathing stopped. Her face gradually paled, and she felt like vomiting. Especially when she saw the many marks on the old monk's body, her energy started to tremble. But at this time, Ding Ning gripped her hand and shook his head at her. Zhang Sun Qinxue slowly inhaled. The trembling in her energy disappeared. The old monk naturally sensed her desire to help. He did not turn around, but took another step forward. A third person walked out of the darkness. This person used a flying sword. When the flying sword flew out 100 feet away from the old monk, the third person was already dead. This was because this cultivator had forced out all of his vital essence in this instant, pouring it into this sword. This crimson-red sword started to burn and fell in a straight line towards the old monk like a meteor. The old monk turned his body slightly. The power of this flying sword swept away the rags on his body and passed over the frozen lake behind the old monk. It stabbed into the glacier behind him and then gave off an earth-shaking explosion. The ice on the surface started to jump. A fourth cultivator walked over. This was a giant much taller than ordinary people. He dragged an enormous iron hammer in his hand. When this cultivator raised the iron hammer in his hand, the old monk's staff pierced his heart meridian. The iron hammer fell and created a deep hole in front of the old monk. Ice and snow flew up and landed on the old monk's body. Next was the fifth, the sixth. It was a shocking frequency. After one person was killed, another person would immediately walk in front of the old monk and then be killed. One cultivator after another walked over silently to accept their deaths. Chapter 540. The old monk's wooden staff grew heavy. The heaviness came from the exhaustion of his stamina and the resolve of these death soldiers. The realms of these death soldiers were far from his. The sword essence, or the explosive power of the second cultivator who exploded all of his vital energy, was only able to land on the old monk because of the old monk's choice. For the old monk's body, the power that barely left a mark on his skin was no different than someone hitting him with a spoon. In order to save as much stamina as possible, the old monk controlled his consumption to the extreme. Sometimes, when he used the staff, he would rather endure the damage of a spoon to reduce the consumption of his vital energy. But even the smallest injury was still injury. More of the exhaustion came from the high concentration of his mind. The goal of every cultivator who walked over was not to survive, but to deliver their lives to the tip of his staff. Their final strike before death was not because they were worried about their own lives, but because they wanted to inflict as much damage as possible on him. If he was not focused, then these cultivators who were much weaker than him could really cause serious damage to him just by relying on their willpower. As the wooden staff grew heavy, the old monk's skin started to heat up and his breathing grew hot. On the other side of the darkness, the ghostly army had thinned out. Yet the cultivators who came in front of the old monk to die still had calm gazes and an incomprehensible indifference. The only difference was the general who stood at the front of the army. At this moment, his eyes were filled with confidence, and they flickered with a kind of fanatical flame, like a fire burning under the surface of ice. Blood flowed between his lips and teeth under the black mask. When the first deputy general walked up to meet his death, his snow-white teeth had already bitten through his own lips, but he didn't feel any pain at all. Pain, this kind of physical sensation, did not seem to exist to him. He had vision that no cultivator could compare to. In this thick darkness, he could even see the old monk's every movement. At this time, he was seriously watching the old monk's every attack and the trajectory of the wooden staff in the darkness. The time was actually very short. However, as the powerful wills disappeared one after another, fresh lives died one after another, bringing with them a will so cold that no one could understand them. This caused time to become exceptionally long. The number of people behind the leading general was extremely small, only a few dozen left. But suddenly, his eyes seemed to have caught something, and his gray eyes suddenly lit up. His body had just started to move slightly when a soldier who was about to walk out behind him keenly sensed the change in his energy and instantly stopped. Then the leading general started to move. The old monk's staff had just come out of a cultivator's chest. The blood seeping out of this cultivator's heart was immediately frozen by the extreme cold. The front of the old monk's staff maintained a high temperature due to the rapid flow and friction of the primal energies of the universe. So the drops of hard blood were still sticky at the tip. The soldiers in front of him, or rather, cultivators and death warriors, were more appropriate to describe them. Their 200 corpses piled up together. While they could not compare to the thousands of corpses piled up in Chongling's battle back then, they had piled up into a small mountain on the ice. The general, who was moving quickly passed through the ice-cold air. Just as the several drops of viscous blood on the old monk's staff were about to fall, about to congeal, this general's figure already appeared at the peak of this mountain of corpses. The old monk suddenly raised his head. The senses between experts could not be described with words. Even though this general's presence was no different from the cultivators he had killed before, he instinctively sensed great danger. He did not hesitate and took another step forward. This step was the distance of dozens of steps for ordinary people, and he reached the foot of the mountain of corpses. He took a step with his right foot. The moment his right foot landed, a powerful force caused the deep ice to explode. Before the hot air from the hot lake could come out of the ice, all the corpses, including the snow-hoe corpses that had turned into ice sculptures, were thrown into the air. Using the power of this step, a vast power surged out of the old monk's body. With a boom, his staff seemed to carry the hot lake under his feet as he stabbed towards the general who was falling through the rain of corpses. The wooden staff moved through the air so quickly that all of this seemed to stop. Yet the general's figure flashed among the flying corpses, disappeared, and then appeared in front of the old monk. A piece of ice suddenly accelerated along his two outstretched fingers. Bearing the power of him and the surrounding world, it stretched towards the old monk's forehead. The old monk's pupils suddenly contracted. His true cultivation was second only to Yuan Wu, and he had received Ding Ning's teachings. Even if Yuan Wu attacked with him, they could not be as fast as him. But at this time, he was certain that the ice sword formed by this piece of ice would be faster than his staff. The rapid flow of energy around the two and the dryness in his body clearly reminded him that the other general was a true Realm 7 Grandmaster, and not an ordinary Realm 7. Even more importantly, the other seemed to have seen through his sword moves and accurately saw the state of his body. He had used up too much energy, and his attacks were slower than before. This general was not like those who were sending people to their deaths. He was a rare Grandmaster. This general had seen through his sword moves. When all of these people were added together, it was enough to defeat him. There was an explosion. The old monk's left foot also gave off an incredible power. Pieces of the cracked ice flew out. The old monk's body retreated at a terrifying speed, and the direction of the staff in his hand changed slightly. Two sizzling sounds were heard. Below the old monk's neck, a sword wound appeared on his left shoulder. The general's left hand was in front of his forehead. The center of his left hand had been completely penetrated. Two balls of bloody mist floated in the air for a moment before being frozen into red powder and falling down. The old monk's feet stepped on the ice and retreated a dozen steps until he was in front of Ding Ning. The general looked indifferently from the air at the old monk, Ding Ning, and Zhongsun Qinxue. His body flew backwards like a kite and landed in front of the few ghost soldiers. The old monk's wooden staff fell to the ground and trembled. The hot air and pieces of ice on the ground flew up like the entire hot lake was about to fly up. "Who is it?" Zhongsun Qinxue took a deep breath and looked at Ding Ning, who had a grave expression. "Not from the Chu," Ding Ning said slowly. Previously, he had been the one to say to Zhongsun Qinxue and the old monk that this came from the Chu army. Now he was also the one to say it was not from the Chu. But Zhongsun Qinxue did not find it strange. Anyone's judgment would change because of the other. "Very strong?" Ding Ning looked at her and said seriously. The old monk coughed softly and spat out some blood. He wanted to pull out the wooden staff stuck in the ice, but Ding Ning looked at him and shook his head. "Do not attack again. If you attack again, you will not be able to leave the glacier and return." The old monk nodded and did not insist. This was a very objective matter. Any cultivator who wanted to live would have to consider whether their vital energy and stamina could support them until they could go back and walk out of this glacier along the path they had come. He raised his head and followed the flow of wind created by the general as he fell through the air, sensing the general's existence. The general was also injured, but the other's wounds seemed to be a calculated price. The other still had the power to fight. Just now's attack was the result that the general had sacrificed so many people in exchange. Zhang Sun Qinxue looked up. She took a step forward. She proudly stood in front of the old monk and Ding Ning. Her pride was not just because she was one of the strongest female cultivators in the world, but also because she always lived according to her own wishes and never bowed to the will of others. This was true pride, nobility. Chapter 541. A clear wind tunnel appeared in the wind and snow ahead. Even in the darkness, one could see it clearly. It was a passage left behind by a person flying through the air at high speed. The moment the general retreated, wounded, a cultivator behind him took his place. So when Zhang Sun Qinxue looked up, a sword tip appeared in the wind tunnel. This sword intent was very strong, as if it was carrying a starry sky as it descended. Not only was its speed extremely fast, the sword intent pointed at a myriad of twinkling stars. It was impossible to determine which star was the true Death Star. A person who could use such a sword essence was not weak in Chongling. But this cultivator encountered Zhang Sun Qinxue. In Chongling, Zhang Sun Qinxue could easily kill Fan Zhua, who had followed by Shan Shui for many years. Also, she cultivated extreme cold. If not for Ding Ning's dual cultivation, this extreme cold was enough to kill her. In this extremely cold glacier, she was like Bai Shan Shui in the water, a true emperor. She reached out with her right hand. Her jade-like fingers easily caught the tip of the sword stabbing at her. A layer of blue-black frost that was many times darker than the glaciers here spread along the sword with terrifying speed and immediately reached the attacking cultivator's body. With a loud crash, the attacking cultivator was directly shattered. He shattered into blue-black pieces of ice on the ground. The thick black night seemed to be frozen for a moment. Gray ice naturally flew around Zhang Sun Qinxue. Even the old monk behind her felt the bone-chilling cold. But Zhang Sun Qinxue did not pause in her movements. She simply threw out the sword she had caught. With a clang, the cultivator who came through the wind hit Zhang Sun Qinxue's sword. This sword did not seem to have much power, and was sent flying by the cultivator. However, the cold energy from the sword blew onto this cultivator's body. This cultivator's body was still rapidly moving forward, but in the next moment, with a crash sound, he turned into a pile of shattered ice that smashed into the lake surface. There were very few people left in the ghost-like army. The remaining cultivators were not frightened by this scene, but the next cultivator who walked out inexplicably paused. Zhang Sun Qinxue was different from the old monk. Just as the third cultivator walked out, before he even got close, Zhang Sun Qinxue reached out and clenched her hand. She seemed to have gripped a sword and then pulled it out. A powerful life force gushed out from the frozen lake at this time. She was using her life bond sword. Zhang Sun Qinxue's life bond sword appeared in her hand. But the third cultivator facing her did not see her life bond sword at all, because his eyes were directly blinded by the oncoming cold wind, turning into shattered ice beads. Countless crystal patterns appeared in the world, like countless snowflakes connected together. This was because the cold wind and all the water vapor on this ice lake were instantly frozen by the terrifying cold energy, as if space itself was frozen and cracked into countless tiny pieces. The rapid condensation of the air caused countless small explosions in the world. The air outside the lake naturally flowed over and formed an enormous whirlwind around the ice pot. The Nine Hell King sword appeared in the world after being silent for countless years, and released its power without holding back. Zhang Sun Qinxue swung her sword. She wasn't just aiming at the third cultivator, but at the army in front of her with all her strength. This attack was called Cold Wave. This was the true tide. For the first time, chaos appeared in the ghostly army. All kinds of light flashed, but only for a moment. Then there were the sounds of shattering and metal falling to the ground. The wind blew. The fine ice crystals formed a gray mist. In the mist, the remaining dozens of people no longer existed. Only the general still stood on the lake with one arm in front of him. He held a sword in his hand. This sword was black, small, and narrow, and pressed against his arm like a shield. Nine Hell King's sword. I had not expected it to be eldest Miss Gongsun. As though it was too cold, the general's movements seemed to slow. His voice sounded for the first time, distant and young. Speaking meant they could converse. Zhang Sun Qinshua looked at this cultivator, who should be very young, and said coldly, "You are from Chongling?" If one has lived in Chongling for a long time, one could be considered a person of Chongling. The general slowly walked toward Zhang Sun Qinshua and said, "It is the army that Zheng Xiu has been hiding." The nine-death silkworm in Ding Ning's body spat out some pure primal energies of the universe to clear his mind. He finally confirmed the identity of this army and spoke softly behind Zhang Sun Qinshua. Zhang Sun Qinshua frowned slightly, her voice slightly cold. "God-killing army, by Qi?" The general did not respond. At a time like this, no response meant silent agreement. The God-killing army was Zheng Xiu's most treasured army, hidden in the mausoleum all day. No one knew the origins of this army. They only knew that this army of the Qin dynasty once had only one goal: to kill Wang Jingming. This was the army that Zheng Xiu had secretly trained and hidden. Even back then, no one on the Bazin Kendo ground knew of the existence of this army. Before this army matured, a great change occurred. Wang Jingming had died in battle. Wang Jingming had died, but this powerful god-killing army had survived. An army trained with the goal of killing Wang Jingming did not mean they could truly kill Wang Jingming. But just now, the hundreds of people were enough to show their power. If an army like this returned to the former Chongling, it could at least guarantee that Wang Jingming would not have been able to enter the imperial palace. This was the army that Zheng Xiu treasured the most. They had not fully matured a decade ago, but now they were mature and terrifying. Now, Zheng Xiu had left this army here. Even Zhang Sun Qinshua, who was not skilled in scheming, knew what Zheng Xiu wanted to do. Her voice grew colder. Zheng Xiu also wants this sword. Zheng Xiu also lacks a powerful life-bond sword. Ding Ning slowly took a breath. He also understood why this army was able to arrive here one step ahead of them. Because of Gu Huai. Gu Huai had said to him before his death that this sword was not at the Lingshu Sword Gate, but this did not mean that Gu Huai did not know where this sword could be. He and Zheng Xiu most likely suspected that this sword could be in the glaciers at the edge of Donghu. So, Zheng Xiu had started a war against Wuji. Other than the heaven-replenishing divine art and the ancestral lands, there was another hidden secret. It was here, this sword. The battle against Wuji was not just to attract the attention of Wuji and Donghu, but also to attract the attention of the Chu dynasty and Min Mountain Sword sect. So this god-killing army could come here without anyone noticing. If that assassination against Enbausher had not occurred, if Enbausher's corpse had not been washed to the tundra under the glaciers, and not coincidentally discovered by the Donghu herdsmen, then this sword would have landed in Zheng Xiu's hands. Ding Ning felt a chill, but he also felt lucky. But he was also puzzled. He slightly changed his voice and said, 13 or 14 years ago, how old were you and all the members of this god-killing army? Why did you have to kill Wang Jingming? The resolve this army had shown could only have come from hatred, and not from Zheng Xiu. Chapter 542. Fortunate to meet the Nine Hell King's sword. Fortunate to meet the eldest miss of the Gongsun family. This general was the commander of the god-killing army, by Qi. He glanced at Ding Ning and then back at Zhang Sun Qinshua. He said, but not everyone is interested in telling the past to the enemy in a situation like this. In a sense, he looked at himself and said, Wang Jingming represents the Bazin Kendo ground. Now, you represent the Bazin Kendo ground. There was frozen blood at the corner of his robes. While his wounds were no longer bleeding, the wounds caused by the old monk's battle were much more serious than a bleeding wound that was still bleeding from the front to the back. In such a cold place lacking in primal energies of the universe, he did not have much time to waste. Ding Ning heard Bai Qi's disdain, but he looked calmly at Bai Qi and said, "The Bazinkindo ground has never been afraid of settling accounts, but at least we have to know where the accounts come from." Bai Qi slowly raised his head and looked at the night sky. He said indifferently, "Only those who are still alive can settle accounts." There was no meaning in settling accounts with the dead. Ding Ning understood Bai Qi's meaning. He was the one who could settle accounts, and Ding Ning, Zhangsun Qinxue, and this old monk would die here. But Ding Ning did not think so. He looked at Bai Qi, who was slowly looking up at the night sky. He did not speak to Bai Qi, but to Zhangsun Qinxue in front of him. He said in a voice only he and Zhangsun Qinxue could hear, "His confidence comes from Zheng Xiu. This place is extremely cold and belongs to your domain. But it is also very high. The primal energies of the universe are thin, but it is closer to the stars. It is easier for the star energies to fall, so this is also Zheng Xiu's domain. Zheng Xiu has already obtained the heaven-replenishing divine art, so I will not interfere with her battle. Otherwise, she will know that I am not dead." Looking at Zhangsun Qinxue, who suddenly turned around, Ding Ning said seriously, "You have no advantage over Zheng Xiu here, but you wanted to fight her many years ago. In these years in Chongling, you have been waiting for a chance to fight her fairly. So I have confidence in you. You have confidence in me, so of course I will win." Zhangsun Qinxue let out a rare laugh. She had always been noble and cold, but at this moment, her smile was blooming with fanaticism. Many years ago, she was already unwilling to accept this. She did not think that she would lose to Zheng Xiu. But Wang Jingming had already accepted Zheng Xiu. Even if she won in the sword, there was no meaning. So proudly, she floated away and left Chongling alone. She thought that the destruction of the Gongsun family was caused by Wang Jingming, so her love turned into hatred. She couldn't forgive Wang Jingming. But when Wang Jingming died in battle in Chongling, she returned to Chongling. She cultivated in seclusion in Chongling. She did not think about anything else. She thought about having a chance to fight Zheng Xiu and then kill her. In the past many years, this was the only meaning in her life. Many stars suddenly lit up in the black sky. Because this place was so close to the sky, these stars appeared very large and eerie. At this moment, even the brightest stars seemed abnormally pale. Then, these stars that seemed to be within reach of one's hand began to burn. Strands of exceptionally heavy flames drifted down. A life bond presence slowly came out of Bai Qi's body. A true life bond sword appeared in his hand. This sword was narrow, long, and transparent. There were no seal scripts on it. It was like an ordinary pure, white crystal, but it carried a kind of cold murderousness. When Bai Qi held the sword across his chest, this sword seemed to turn into a mirror. Countless beams of pale, white starfire fell down and landed on his sword. Every time, it is like this, is it really good to use so many people? Ding Ning thought of Gu Huai and more people. He sneered and shook his head. Bai Qi calmly pushed this sword forward. In this moment, he appeared very relaxed, because this was not a sword essence that belonged to him. What he needed to do was to be a mirror and reflect this sword essence. He believed that the mistress of the imperial palace had sensed the presence of the Nine Hell King's sword. So the starfire that landed on his sword this time was cold, but exceptionally hot. Pale, white starfire fell on the mirror-like sword, flowing down the edges of the sword like a waterfall. It formed a thin layer, parallel to the frozen lake, and sliced towards Zhangsun Qinxue. Zhangsun Qinxue's smile suddenly disappeared. Just like how the thinner a person's lips were, the sharper and colder they appeared. Countless beams of starfire condensed into a layer thinner than a snowflake. It looked like an ordinary horizontal slash, but it carried a boundlessly powerful aura. She had not seen Zheng Xiu for many years, but now, she knew that what Ding Ning had said to her before was correct. In these years, Zheng Xiu had become more terrifying than before. When she fought at full power, she surpassed her imagination. The faint blue color quickly flowed and accumulated in her right hand. The Nine Hell King sword had once been thought of as the fiercest and coldest sword in the world. At this time, its power was released in Zhang Sun Qinshua's hand. The deep color deepened and released power that could intimidate the soul. But in the next moment, Zhang Sun Qinshuo threw away many of the strongest swords of the Gongsun family, and some of the strongest sword moves she had learned in these years. She used a sword move that was not too special. The fiercest and coldest sword in her hand gently drew forward, just like an eyebrow pencil drawing a line, landing on the incoming thin layer of sparks. The name of this sword move was Drawing Eyebrows. This sword move was entangled with many old matters of Chongling. It was the sword move that Wang Jingming had used to defeat the Chun young master Ji Qingqing. This sword move was not hard to comprehend, and was very ordinary for most swordsmen in Chongling. Back then, Wang Jingming had used this ordinary sword move to win against Ji Qingqing. He had slashed Ji Qingqing's face, mostly to humiliate her. At this time, Zhang Sun Qinshuo used this move because she really wanted to use this sword move to slash Zheng Xiu's face. Did she have any shame? This was her sword essence. The sword intent that she had accumulated for many years represented her deepest obsession. So the sword essence of this sword was extremely powerful. In Ding Ning's eyes, it was undefeatable, perfect, and powerful. Kacha, all of a sudden, a thin crystal crack that was as thin as a spider web appeared on the thin layer of sparks. Then the fine crystal cracks covered this layer of starfire and spread to Bai Qi's sword. Bai Qi's breathing suddenly stopped. His intuition told him that his sword had been struck by countless huge mountains. A beast-like howl naturally burst out from his throat. His left hand landed on the sword hilt, and blood splattered from his right hand. Only then was he able to suppress the sword and prevent it from flying out of his hand. The starfire broke. It looked like it was rolling towards the stars. It also looked like burning white ropes were burning towards the sky. In the imperial palace of Chongling, a soft pop sounded. Standing in front of the spirit spring, Zheng Xiu leaned forward slightly, and a mouthful of blood came out of her lips. The white lotus in the spirit spring was sprinkled with many drops of scarlet blood, rolling like dewdrops. Chapter 543. Her brow furrowed deeply, as though she felt the sword essence land on her brow. But inexplicably, even though this was the first time she had been injured like this after leaving Jiaodong Commandery, there was no anger in her eyes. Bai Qi howled like a wild beast. His fingers trembled countless times in a breath. He forcibly controlled the power of the life-bond sword in his hand, and furiously poured more power into it. Just now, he had lost, but that was the power of the mistress of the imperial palace, and not his power. He was a powerful cultivator who had stabbed the almost invincible old monk. Zhang Sun Qinshuo had defeated the mistress of the imperial palace with one blow, but the starfire was so strong that even the old monk at his peak could not have escaped unscathed. No one could win against him and Zheng Xiu working together. That was what he thought. Everyone in this army who had died before him had thought so as well. Just like the deputy general said from the start. Today, everyone here would die, but he would live. He controlled the power of the life-bond sword in his hand, and then slashed toward Zhang Sun Qinshuo. This was a very thin sword essence. It was so thin it did not seem to exist, but it felt like it could cut through everything, even the world. Zhang Sun Qinshuo slowly pulled back her sword. She could not stop this sword, but she knew she would not die because she was familiar with this sword. When she put away her sword, a hand reached out from behind her, grabbing this extremely vicious and extremely cold sword. It might even be the world's most powerful sword before the Great Punishment Sword was born. Then, this hand did not cause any resistance from her life-bond sword at all. It even carried her life-bond power and stabbed forward. The Nine Hell King's sword, which carried the darkest color in the world, buzzed and vibrated. It brought out an unusually bright sword light, illuminating this dark ice lake. Bai Qi's breathing suddenly stopped. The Nine Hell King's sword was the most vicious and coldest sword in the world. Ordinary Realm 7 cultivators could not control the power of this sword. If they used it, they would be corroded by the cold energy. But what shocked him the most was not that Ding Ning was controlling this sword like he was controlling his own Lifebond sword. Even more importantly, the unusually bright sword light that Ding Ning had easily destroyed his sword essence. Many mirror-like pieces flew in front of him, and then he heard an explosion between his wrists. The bones of his wrists were broken. Almost at the same time, with a loud bang, his body crashed into the frozen surface of the lake and slid backwards as if he was plowing the ground. Amid the hoarse sound of his body rubbing against the shattered ice, Bai Qi looked up. Blood seeped out of his throat and dyed his thick face cloth red. There was still no fear of death in his eyes. He knew very well that if the other sword had wanted him dead, he would have died long ago. Ding Ning calmly put away his sword and returned the Nine Hell King's sword to Zhongsun Qinshue's hands. He looked at Bai Qi, who was embedded in the ice but still staring at him. He slowly said, "You may be interested in telling the enemy about the past. So you are the heir to the 9-Death Silkworm." Bai Qi suddenly laughed. "My sword is Wang Jingming's sword essence. You were able to easily defeat it because you understand this sword essence better than I do. So the heir to the 9-Death Silkworm, who made all of Chongling suspicious and fearful, is so young." Ding Ning did not respond. He looked silently at Bai Qi. Bai Qi stopped laughing. He looked disdainfully at Ding Ning and said, "Is there meaning?" Ding Ning looked at him and said, "Not necessarily, but there may be meaning." "What meaning?" Bai Qi sneered. "When your Bazinkindo ground army passed through in the past, did you care about adding a few innocent corpses to your arrows?" Ding Ning frowned slightly. "Innocent corpses?" Bai Qi looked at him and said coldly, "When your Bazinkindo ground army attacked the city, did you care about the lives of ordinary people in the city?" Ding Ning seemed to understand. He looked up slightly at the corpses of the cultivators on the ice and asked, "Your army became orphans because the Bazinkindo ground army fought against the 3 dynasties?" Bai Qi sneered but did not speak. Ding Ning thought for a moment and did not speak. Zhongsun Qinshui could not help but laugh coldly. "If so, then you should have killed Zheng Xiu and Yuan Wu. Is it the Bazinkindo ground that has the world now? According to what you say, the Bazinkindo ground was just used by Zheng Xiu and Yuan Wu. The true culprits of your family's destruction should be Zheng Xiu and Yuan Wu. But you put this on the Bazinkindo ground. Do you not find this laughable? Is that so?" Bai Qi's voice did not fluctuate as he said coldly, "In the past, during the Battle of Chongping, the Qin army had a surprise troop that went around the Sea River to ambush the Zhao army in the outskirts of Chongping. Along the way, they encountered a caravan from Luzhong. There were some Zhao cultivators among them. To prevent the news from being leaked, the Qin army killed all 300 people in the caravan. That surprise troop was led by the Bazinkindo ground's Wang Jingming, the strategist Lin Zhujiu." Zhongsun Qinshue's face suddenly paled. She could not help but turn a look at Ding Ning. The expression on Ding Ning's face became strange. "That caravan was completely killed?" He looked at Bai Qi and asked curiously. "Occasionally, there will be accidents, such as a fish that escapes the net." Bai Qi looked down with slight disdain. "If you want to hear about the past, this is my past." Ding Ning looked calmly at him. "So you are the fish that escaped the net?" Bai Qi did not answer. He thought that he did not need to. "So your army more or less has a past like this?" Ding Ning laughed. "Such a coincidence." Bai Qi's expression turned cold. "What do you mean?" "Such a coincidence is such a coincidence." Ding Ning looked at Bai Qi and said slowly and seriously, "I do not know about the past of other people in your army, but your past, speaking of this caravan, I know about it. You think that Wang Jingming ordered this caravan to be killed?" Bai Qi looked at Ding Ning like he was an idiot. "What you know is more real than what I experienced. What you experienced and saw is not a true story." Ding Ning's expression did not change. He just stated calmly, "The true past is that Wang Jingming only ordered the caravan to be surrounded and stopped there. The true past is that after trapping the caravan, Wang Jingming and the people of the Bazinkindo ground led this surprise troop to the battlefield at their fastest speed. The only one who stayed at the back and had the ability to change orders was someone who would never appear on the battlefield. It was Zheng Xiao. Zhang Sun Qinshuo suddenly understood and couldn't help but speak. Bai Qi's body shook inexplicably. Ding Ning did not speak and looked calmly at him. How do you know about the past? Bai Qi thought and then looked at Ding Ning. He said, You are too young, so you are not convincing. Ding Ning smiled faintly and sorrowfully. Whether it is convincing or not depends on the facts. Since you have memories, you should remember that the army hurried on their way after encountering you. The small army that surrounded you should have acted a long time after the main army left. If they wanted to kill this caravan directly, it would not have been so troublesome. When the army passed, nothing would be left of this caravan. Bai Qi sat up from the ice. His body trembled inexplicably. You know. Ding Ning looked at him and said, If you have memories, you may remember that there may have been a conflict in the army that was left behind, because 2 people from the Bazin Kindo ground died. The people left behind said that the 2 people from the Bazin Kindo ground encountered cultivators from Zhao. But now that I think about it, those 2 would have opposed Zheng Xiao's actions. Also, there is something you may not know. Most of the reinforcements left behind came from Jiaodong Commandery and were mostly her family generals. Too many coincidences are not coincidences. After a pause, he looked at Bai Qi and said, First, you made a mistake. The Bazin Kindo ground does not care about the lives of ordinary people when the army passes by. The Bazin Kindo ground's army is extremely strict and may use schemes or assassinations. Most battles will be led, and the 2 armies will face each other in the wilderness. Millions of soldiers will decide victory with one blow. Accidental injuries and deaths cannot be avoided, but to gather an army like this, to gather an army that, for various reasons, has deep hatred towards Wang Jingming and the Bazin Kindo ground. In these short years, it is such a coincidence. Even if there are only a few hundred of you. Ding Ning shook his head emotionally. He has only led for a few years. How can he do something like this every few days? Even the bandits who specialize in robbing caravans do not have such frequency and cannot do so many evil things. The people of the Bazin Kindo ground are not bandits. Bai Qi's breathing seemed to stop. The surface of the lake was silent. Zhang Sun Qinshuo sneered. Even I understand, you do not? Her voice was filled with disdain, but naturally, she was not disdaining herself. She said that even she herself understood. It was only because she usually only thought about cultivation and would not waste energy to think about other problems. Now, Ding Ning did not seem to need much consideration for what he said. She added scornfully, framing others, pretending to be innocent, changing military orders. This is what Zheng Xiao is best at. What is the true past? Ding Ning did not look at Bai Qi. He turned and walked towards the icicle erected by the sword essence under the lake. His voice sounded in the cold air. This exists in your own judgment. I will keep your life now. How you use it is up to you. Chapter 544. Ding Ning looked at the icicle in front of him. He did not know how deep the ice on the surface of the lake was, but after the fierce battle, the frozen surface of the lake had cracked into countless pieces. As the hot air surged out of the hot lake, some of the cracks grew larger. This ice pillar was originally formed by the sword essence. At this moment, the tiny cracks on the ice pillar were continuously emitting wisps of white mist. The thin but powerful sword essence was becoming more and more obvious. Ding Ning smiled emotionally. He sensed the strong desire of this sword to break out of its shell. This sword had been sealed for too long. Famed swords were like beauties. How could such a peerless sword be willing to be sealed forever in this lake and not let the world see its glory? This sword did not want to be trapped here forever. It had only formed the sword cleansing pool for a sect. It had been a powerful sword. How could it be interested in those ordinary swords? How could it be willing to serve those ordinary swords? The sword had been resisting all this time, which was why an icicle had formed on the surface of the ice. How do you know so many things of the past? At this moment, A mournful howl like that of a wild beast suddenly rang out from behind. Ding Ning did not look back. He said calmly and clearly, "The problem is not how I know, but that it is the truth. The problem is that you are still alive. With your present abilities, if you want to investigate, you will know that it is the truth. I'm leaving my life to you now to give you a choice. Are you willing to believe lies and live, or live a different life?" Bai Qi howled madly from behind. No one could understand what he was howling about. However, Ding Ning could empathize with him and understand what he was feeling right now. Just like the past, "You should be glad that you still have the chance to choose again," he said in his heart. Then he reached out and touched the cracked icicle in front of him. Crack, crack, crack. It was only a faint aura that landed on the ice pillar, but it instantly caused countless terrifying cracking sounds to be emitted from the ice pillar. The old monk's dim and turbid eyes suddenly lit up. The countless ear-piercing shattering sounds pierced all the way to the bottom of the lake. Then, the sword that had been imprisoned by some unknown method at the bottom of the lake suddenly trembled. The sword's trembling and struggling caused a furious and frenzied roar to resound from the bottom of the lake. Countless streaks of light appeared on the frozen lake. The entire surface of the lake, which had a radius of countless miles, seemed to have been cut into countless irregular small pieces by the sword light. Previously, the heat at the bottom of the lake was only sizzling upwards, thin and faint. However, at this moment, the white-hot air was like a fountain. It was like a wall of pleasure as it rushed up from the bottom of the lake. The water vapor in the air quickly condensed and froze, turning into countless tiny ice crystals that hit the surface of the lake, making popping sounds. Ding Ning's face was still calm, but there was a strange expression on his face. He sensed the position of the sword, but at the same time, he also sensed powerful forces that locked onto the sword like giant ropes trapping a dragon. These giant ropes were the power left behind by the expert at the Lingshu sword gate. He and this sword had cultivated together for a long time, and the power of the formation he had set up. This kind of power was extremely powerful, even surpassing Realm 7. But at this time, Ding Ning only maintained his outstretched hand. The entire icicle had completely shattered. As the hot air from the bottom of the lake surged upwards like a fountain, the shattered pieces of ice flew up like flowers. A piece of ice cut through Ding Ning's palm. Ding Ning did not resist and allowed the piece of ice to cut through the skin of his palm. No blood flowed out, but there were numerous pale streams that dripped onto the ice in front of him like countless little silkworms. Many rustling sounds sounded. These little silkworms arrived at the place where the sword was bound at the bottom of the lake with unimaginable speed. Then, they gathered on one of the giant chains that bound the sword. Then, as if they were nibbling on mulberry leaves, they instantly bit through this giant chain. They only cut off one of the many strands of power, but Ding Ning only said softly, "Now it is up to you." As he spoke as though he was talking to the sword, a sword essence flowed out of his fingertip, along the path that the little silkworms had passed through, and landed on the sword. This was a very simple soaring sword form. This was the simplest sword essence of controlling a flying sword. It just needed the sword to fly into the air. However, when this simple sword intent landed on the sword came to life. All of the other giant ropes at the bottom of the lake snapped in this moment. With a loud bang, many huge blocks of ice that were as big as houses flew up from the frozen lake. It was as if there were many huge octopuses at the bottom of the lake that were whipping up in pain. This sword flew up. A powerful sword essence was released and caused all of the legendary beasts in the distant glaciers and ice plains to feel terror. A circular abyss appeared in front of Ding Ning, and then it was like the sun. Countless bright rays of light surged out of the abyss at a speed faster than the heat. It was as if a scorching sun had risen from the abyss. This powerful sword intent moved up very slowly, as if someone was slowly pulling out a sword. However, the first thing that appeared in the bright light was not the sword hilt, but the sword tip. Zhang Sun Qinxue narrowed her eyes. It was not because the sword light was too dazzling, but because the Nine Hell King sword in the depths of her chi sea was also constantly vibrating, feeling an enormous pressure. A long time ago, the judgment of Wang Jingming and the people of the Bazinkindo ground was not wrong. The legendary Great Punishment Sword of the Lingshu Sword Gate was the most astounding sword in the world, and a peerless sword that could suppress the Nine Hell King's sword in presence. But this sword was made in a very unique way. The blade of this sword was wider and thicker than ordinary swords, and slightly shorter than ordinary swords. The color of this sword was between an ordinary cyan and an iron gray color, and there were no clear runes on it. There was only a natural flower-like pattern left behind from the forging and smelting of the sword. This sword was in the dazzling light, but it was extremely simple. So simple that it was like a thick iron ruler that had not been completely forged, a sword embryo that had not been completed. Ding Ning smiled emotionally. This was the sword he had waited for a long time, and could be described as his entire life. He didn't make any unnecessary movements. He just completely let go of his current thoughts and emotions, allowing the sword to sense them. All of the sounds at the bottom of the lake disappeared. The enormous ice that had been shaken up by the great power was falling down, and there were soul-shaking sounds of collisions everywhere. But the world of the four people on the surface of the lake seemed to have become completely silent. Very naturally, this sword that had broken free from the restraints at the bottom of the lake landed in Ding Ning's hand. Ding Ning gripped the hilt of this sword. The old monk's breathing stopped, and he looked in disbelief at this scene. Only a cultivator of his level could clearly sense how difficult it was to break free of the restraints of the Lingshu Sword Gate expert and cut off the life bond energy that expert left behind. Even he could not do it in a short time. The sword is a friend, a confidant. Ding Ning knew that he was puzzled. He slowly turned around, looked at him, and said, "Only when it has life, when both sides follow their wills, can they truly receive the greatest help. The sword essence needs the sword essence and the cultivator's own will to be at the same place, and then the strongest power can be displayed." Chapter 545. This was sword theory. But many theories were easy to understand, but hard to do. The old monk thought seriously and asked, "How do I do it?" Ding Ning looked at him and said, "A sincere heart." The old monk thought for a moment and nodded. He said, "Just like how all things in the world have their true appearance, cultivators have the purest hearts." Ding Ning nodded, and his gaze landed on the sword in his hand. This sword started to breathe freely. The primal energies of the world were attracted by this sword and flooded into the sword. This was a sword strong enough to rule all swords in the world and rule the world. The Nine Hell King's sword in Zhongsun Qinchua's body trembled again, like it sensed fatal danger. But at this time, Zhongsun Qinchua's gaze did not land on this sword. Her gaze landed on the cracked, frozen surface of the lake that was spewing hot air everywhere. A staggering figure was leaving, struggling to pass through the layers of white heat, like he was breaking through a wall. "He is seriously wounded," Zhongsun Qinshua looked at Bai Qi's figure and said with a frown. "A cultivator like him who can lead an army like this, since he chose to live, he will not die here." Ding Ning glanced at her and said. A faint life bond aura then wrapped around the great torture chamber in his hand from between his fingers. This lifeblood aura carried a hint of melancholy. Many years ago, if Wang Jingming had obtained this sword when he had risen on the Bazinkindo ground, then even with the change in Chongling, the result would have been different. This sword had been frozen at the bottom of the lake, waiting for many years to see the light of day again. Similarly, Ding Ning had been searching for a life-bond sword like this for many years. This great punishment sword seemed to sense the sadness in this life-bond presence and started to give off a presence. This aura was that of knowing and protecting each other. This rock-hard, solemn presence was like the presence of a thick shield in front of an ordinary soldier facing a rain of arrows on the battlefield. The old monk lowered his head and praised in his heart once more. This was the acceptance of a natal item. In the world of cultivators, it was also known as master recognition. For ordinary cultivators, this process would probably take many years. However, it only took Ding Ning a moment. The pale white sparks were still rolling back into the sky. In the silent imperial palace of Chongling, Zheng Xiu slowly looked up and wiped away a trace of blood at the corner of her mouth. In her consciousness, the presence of the sword that countless top cultivators in Chongling wanted to obtain finally disappeared. The Bazinkindo ground wanted the sword. Wang Jingming wanted that sword. Yuanwu also wanted that sword. All of Jiaodong Commandery, and she wanted that sword. However, she now knew that the sword had been refined into a natal sword. She knew that the 9-death silkworm that had once hidden in Chongling had finally grown strong. There were many stars in the starry sky. In the world of cultivators, there were countless cultivators. At every moment, there were people refining their life bond items. In the cave where the old monk had been cultivating, Li Shixing sat cross-legged on the old monk's couch. There was a crystal yellow light in front of him that constantly changed into various sword shapes. Yet, no matter what kind of sword shape it took, it seemed to be unable to bear his sword essence. In other words, he and this life bond sword were still lacking. The glaciers on the Donghu border had never changed, but as time passed, the coldness in Chongling faded. The difference between a true wise person and a fool was only time, before and after. Winter was about to pass and spring was coming. Before winter, very few people detected that the Qin dynasty was going to attack the Chu in spring. Yet at this time, the atmosphere in Chongling grew heavier. Even the ordinary people in the streets started to sense a familiar presence from the movement of some military supplies and supplies. The familiar presence came from before Yuanwu ascended the throne, when the Qin dynasty destroyed the Han, Zhao, and Wei. 2 carriages would pass by a broken bridge. This broken bridge was in a shady corner of an alley in Chongling where the snow had not melted. One of the 2 carriages came from the Divinity Bureau, the other from the Astrology Bureau. Sitting in the carriages were Chief Inspector Chen and Bureau Chief Yi. In the view of almost everyone in Chongling, these were 2 people who were on opposite sides. Even the 2 bureaus with similar functions were supervising each other and competing against each other. There were countless ways to avoid one person. Only these 2 knew why it was so difficult for them to meet. Why have you not left? In the carriage of the Divinity Bureau, Chief Inspector Chun, dressed in a new deep red robe, still looked dispirited and lonely. He looked straight at the curtain in front of him and asked slowly, walking out of another alley and into the carriages of the Astrology Bureau. Yi Sealing frowned in displeasure. If you are just asking a question you have already asked, then there is no need to meet me here. You do not like this place, and I do not like this place. I wanted to leave many years ago, but you are here. In the dimly lit carriage, Chief Inspector Chen's eyes lit up with a different light. I hope you can leave, and then I will leave with you. Yi Sealing was silent for a moment. Then she looked up at the carriage next to her and said, some things, once explained, are like a cloth. Once removed, there is no meaning. Maybe it means the end. Chief Inspector Chen slowly looked up. He also turned to look at Yi Sealing's carriage. In this short breath of time, his gaze seemed to pierce through thousands of layers of curtains, penetrating through a long time. I know. He slowly nodded and said, but this time, I am asking a different question, because 3 people from Jiaodong Commandery have come. Yi Sealing stilled slightly. Jiaodong Commandery controlled the coastal areas of the Qin dynasty. It was the biggest commandery of the Qin dynasty. It was so powerful that it was more like a vassal country than the Yuezhi, and not a commandery. So it was able to raise a terrifying woman like Zheng Xiu. Jiaodong Commandery had many people coming and going. But since he said in such a tone that there were 3 people, then these 3 people were naturally different from ordinary Jiaodong Commandery people. Who are they? She asked with a frown. 3 people like her who can move all of Jiaodong Commandery. The people of Jiaodong Commandery have always been mysterious, especially her family. In these years, she was the only one from her family who truly entered Chongling. So I do not know the identities of these 3 people. If I have to describe it in words, these 3 people are her family members, the elders of her family. Chief Inspector Chen looked at her through the 2 curtains and said slowly, you should know that her family is dissatisfied with many of her performances after the 9-death silkworm appeared. So since they are elders of her family, they may not act according to her wishes. Yi Sealing could understand the meaning in these words. She was silent for a moment and then said, "Love is an emotion hard to describe with words. Those people in Chongling who speculate that I do not like Chongling but must stay in Chongling think that I love Wang Jingming, who taught me sword skills in the past. But compared to hatred, feelings like love could take a step back. Many of the people who died in Chongling in the past were my friends. Some people who were my friends betrayed those friends. This is the main reason I want to stay in Chongling. I want to take revenge. I want to see some people die and feel that I am useful in Chongling. This is the most important reason I want to stay in Chongling." Yi Sealing suddenly laughed. She looked at Chief Inspector Chan behind the curtains and laughed. "I promise you, if this hatred disappears and you and I are still alive, I will leave Chongling with you. I can take you to see the scenery overseas, those legendary immortal islands. The beautiful scenery is much more beautiful than this flat Chongling. So you have to promise me, you have to at least ensure you can live." After saying this, the carriage she was in moved and left. She did not need to hear the other's answer. Chief Inspector Chan did not answer. "It is very difficult," he said softly and then hung his head. However, there was a hint of joy in his words, which made him seem to be a bit young. Chapter 546. Time passed. Before spring arrived, it rained again in Chongling. Winter rain was not like spring rain and was often annoying. Also, for most cultivators, rain and water meant gentleness. Only a few cultivators in Chongling, like Yi Sealing, had a life bond presence that suited water. The rain could obstruct the perception of cultivators, and it could conceal many of their auras. So in the world of cultivators, many major events would occur with the arrival of heavy rain. Huang Jinwei stood under the roof of a turret, watching silently as a yellow-robed cultivator walked into the imperial palace. This was someone from Jiaodong Commandery. Ever since Yuan Wu ascended the throne, and Zheng Xiao officially became the mistress of the Qin dynasty, this yellow robe that was like dry mud became the unique symbol of the envoys of Jiaodong Commandery. Maybe for some privileges, or to show their unique status, these envoys of Jiaodong Commandery never concealed their identities and had to wear yellow robes like this when they entered Chongling. In the view of many old people in Chongling, this was Jiaodong Commandery's naked humiliation to the old nobility of Chongling. Jiaodong Commandery's earliest strategic importance to the Qin dynasty was just a port that could provide abundant marine products to replenish the meat of the army. Even though Jiaodong Commandery had accumulated great wealth through fishing boats and the trade of some rare spirit medicines, in the eyes of the old nobility of Chongling, the people of Jiaodong Commandery were just country bumpkins, fishermen, and second-rate merchants. But now, all of the Qin dynasty, and even the world, recognized the power and terror of Jiaodong Commandery. The terror was that most of Jiaodong Commandery's great wealth was used to set up spies. Jiaodong Commandery had all kinds of terrifying sources of information. Many secret matters could be hidden from the Divinity Bureau and the Heaven Supervising Temple, but not from Jiaodong Commandery. Other than this, the cultivators who died for Zheng Xiao and Jiaodong Commandery usually came from outside Jiaodong Commandery, especially Zheng Xiao's family, the Zheng family that had raised a cultivator like Zheng Xiao. The outside world knew almost nothing about what kind of cultivators existed in there, because it was remote, and in the eyes of the Chongling people, ever since the Zheng family took control of Jiaodong Commandery, the fires of war had never started in Jiaodong Commandery. Even the yellow-robed cultivator Zhao Gao, who had followed Zheng Xiao to Chongling and witnessed how Zheng Xiao turned from a country girl to the mistress of the Qin dynasty, did not know what kind of people were in the Zheng family and how many there were. Even back then, to kill Wang Jingming and suppress the Bazin Kendo ground, Zheng Xiao had mobilized countless powers in Jiaodong Commandery, but no cultivators from the Zheng family officially appeared or acted. So in these years, the Zheng family of Jiaodong Commandery was still mysterious. Those who were traveling outside were all outer disciples of the Zheng clan. There were even very few blood relatives with the surname Zheng. However, the yellow-robed cultivator heading towards the imperial palace today gave Huang Jinwei a completely different feeling. First of all, this yellow-robed cultivator was rather old. This yellow-robed cultivator was at least 50 to 60 years old, and was a generation older than the yellow-robed messengers from Jiaodong Commandery. Also, he could not see how strong this yellow-robed cultivator was. This yellow-robed cultivator's presence was perfectly hidden in the rain. Even if he was not Realm 8, Huang Jinwei had a strong feeling that he would be killed if he fought against this yellow-robed cultivator. For cultivators of Huang Jinwei's level, strong intuition meant certainty. So this yellow-robed cultivator had to be a true family member of the Zheng family. The yellow-robed man, who looked to be in his 50s and had a medium build, entered the imperial city. He announced his arrival according to the rules and went straight to the emperor's study. Empress Zhengxiu was waiting for him at the door. Eldest uncle. When this yellow-robed man appeared in front of her, she first nodded in greeting and then said expressionlessly, "You should not have come." This man's appearance was very ordinary, and he did not have the presence of an important person. But when he heard Zhengxiu's words, he smiled slightly. His smile was very enchanting. When he was young, just a smile like this could easily enchant some young women. However, right now, when he faced Zhengxiu with this kind of smile, it made him inexplicably filled with a type of imposing and powerful aura. He asked with a smile, "Why should I not have come?" "You have come. You have exposed Jiaodong Commandery's foundation." Zhengxiu looked at him and said coldly, "You are showing weakness." "Showing weakness and lack of skills?" The yellow-robed man's smile grew even wider. He even looked at Zhengxiu with a bit of sympathy. The way he looked at her was the gaze of a true elder looking at a junior. "If it weren't for the fact that my family is too disappointed in you, that you might cause trouble beyond repair, why would I come?" Zhengxiu looked coolly at him. "Disappointed?" The yellow-robed man looked calmly and emotionally at her. "In recent years, you have not cared about the opinions of the family, and have even been threatening the family. But the family has been allowing you more and more, not because they fear your threat, but because Jiaodong Commandery's position in the future of the Qin dynasty is becoming more and more unstable. After the reform, the Qin dynasty does not lack food, and even meat. Jiaodong Commandery's position as the most indispensable meat supplier for the Qin dynasty is disappearing, and the army's reliance on us is growing smaller. So from a certain point of view, our foundation is disappearing, and you are the future of Jiaodong Commandery." When he said this, the yellow-robed man smiled again, but there was sincere emotion and sincerity in his smile. "Previously, the family allowed you to come, not because they feared any external factors, but because you are perfect. Honestly speaking, you are the most perfect genius of Jiaodong Commandery in the past hundreds of years. Your performance before was perfect, but these 2 years are different. You have caused more and more changes, and too many people have died around you. But this is not what the family is worried about. What the family is worried about is your spring expedition this time. You have gambled too much, and could easily have gambled all of Jiaodong Commandery." Zhengxiu's expression was still emotionless. Her white skin gave off a beautiful porcelain light. "So the family has no confidence in me?" The yellow-robed man still did not directly answer her question. He shook his head and said, "It is not a matter of confidence, but the family feels that you should understand that you and the family are one. You should understand that you and the family should walk towards the future of the Qin dynasty together, and not you walking towards the future and the family becoming your pawn." Zhengxiu glanced at him. Before she could speak, the yellow-robed man stopped looking at her. He turned and looked at the sky above Chongling. He said softly, "I remember that Marquis Li's son is called Li Shixing. When he was young, he had a dog drowned. Do not forget, when you were young, you also had a dog drowned." Zhengxiu looked up slightly, and her perfect brow furrowed. Suddenly, she gave a rare laugh, a very cold laugh. "Ever since I was young, anything that I truly loved would be taken away from me by my family. The dog that I liked would be killed. My playmates who studied and cultivated with me would be arranged to become assassins in training. They would all die by my hands. Anything that could distract me from my cultivation, Anything that could cause me to worry would be eliminated by my family. She slowly said, without distraction, without anything that could affect me, I have no weakness. So even Wang Jingming died by my hands. The family sent you to say these words to me, including yourself. Have you thought it through? Before killing him, you may not have a weakness, but it is different now. Your position and your ambition are your greatest weakness, unless you are willing to be under Yuanwu. The yellow-robed man looked emotionally at her and shook his head. Pity that I know you too well. So unless you make the family have confidence in you again, in the following period of time, I will act on behalf of the family. Zheng Xiao was silent for a moment. Then she looked at the back of the yellow-robed man and asked, Since this is the case, you should at least tell me what you're going to do next. Kill. The yellow-robed man's answer was unusually simple, and his smile showed his white teeth. Shen Xian, Pan Rui. He turned his head slightly, glanced at Zheng Xiao, and said, There is one more person I will act against. I have not thought about it. Chapter 547. Zheng Xiao did not say anything else. She turned and walked into her study. The yellow-robed man walking on the path outside the study was very satisfied. Some words were meaningless if spoken too clearly. In these years, Zheng Xiao did not care much about the opinions of the Jiaodong commandery, and just like he said, she had always been threatening them. But unlike what he said, Jiaodong commandery had never been able to give a strong response to Zheng Xiao's threats. Zheng Xiao could leave Jiaodong commandery. After leaving Jiaodong commandery, she would still be the empress of the Qin dynasty. But Jiaodong commandery could not leave Zheng Xiao. Without Zheng Xiao, Jiaodong commandery would be nothing. Even if they had some mysterious and powerful cultivators, in the eyes of the Qin dynasty, they were not as important as Lingshu Sword Gate and Min Mountain Sword Sect. Especially after taking back Yangshan commandery and the Deer Mountain Conference, Jiaodong commandery looked like a shining chariot in the eyes of outsiders. But in the view of Jiaodong commandery, this chariot was at the edge of a cliff. While powerful, it was too heavy and could not stop it from sliding into the abyss. Because they could not give it up, they could only wait. The wait was worth it, at least in the view of Jiaodong commandery. With the deaths of the people around Zheng Xiao had almost no one she could use. This was the weakest she had been since she became the empress. Even though today's conversation was not pleasant, Zheng Xiao could not resist fiercely and was forced to obey. The coming spring war against Chu was too important for Jiaodong commandery. So like all the streams returning to the sea, it was time for Jiaodong commandery to interfere. The chariot that had deviated had to return to the right track and could not be reversed. At least this yellow-robed man thought so. But Zheng Xiao did not think so. Even you think I am perfect. Since I have no weakness, how can you win against me? She looked at the pure white lotus in the spirit spring and heard the footsteps of the yellow-robed man as he left. She thought coldly inside. Chongling's Silver Moon gambling house was not the most eye-catching gambling house in Chongling, but all the gamblers in Chongling knew that this gambling house was the most extraordinary. Dozens of tables were scattered around the seemingly ordinary three-story bungalow. However, they contained a frightening amount of business. For gamblers, whether a gambling house was awe-inspiring or not depended on the amount of water on the table and whether the gambling house had enough legends. The Silver Moon Casino had both. Very few people could estimate how much cash the Silver Moon Casino had. In the Silver Moon Casino, there was no upper limit to the bets on each table. As long as one could afford to bet, as long as one dared to bet, the Silver Moon Casino would accept it. The legend was that someone had once lost an entire fleet of ships here. There was also someone who was penniless but won dozens of shops in Chongling and an alley. There were at least several tables here, and the amount of cash that passed through their hands in a day was more than the treasury of a wealthy family. The bigger the plate, the more guests there would be. In the past, the dozens of tables in this gambling house were all packed, and there was no place to stand. However, the atmosphere today was a little different. The innermost 10 or so tables seemed excessively cold and cheerless. The source of the coldness was the table in the middle. It was the simplest bamboo chip odd and even bet. This kind of odd and even bet was unique to some gambling houses in Chongling. Both the dealer and the gambler had a certain number of bamboo chips. Before each bet, both sides could put any number of bamboo chips into a special container. Then the gambler would bet odd and even, and the number of bamboo chips would be counted to determine if the gambler was right or wrong. This kind of gambling method was extremely fair. The bamboo chips and the containers were special, and even cultivators could not sense them. Yet at this table, a middle-aged man with a slightly dark complexion who looked very wealthy had won more than 20 rounds in a row. He was still sitting in front of the dealer and had no intentions of leaving. He looked like he would continue to win like this. Other than this middle-aged man who looked like an ordinary wealthy merchant and the dealer, there was no one else at this table. When the gambling house could not confirm the other's cheating methods, the gambling house could bear a portion of the loss and let the other take the money and leave. But the gambling house was not a charity. Everything had its own rules. If one did not know when to stop and continue to sit here and win, then there was only one possibility: deliberately coming to cause trouble. Two old shopkeepers dressed in black robes had been watching from a corner of the room for a long time. In the end, they decided they needed to invite an academician inside. The academician who walked out was a man dressed in blue brocade robes. He had a handsome face. Theoretically, being an academician in a place like the Silver Moon gambling house, he had to be a powerful cultivator to be able to become an academician of such a gambling house. His face would naturally appear younger than his actual age. Yet this man's face appeared haggard and old. He gave people the feeling that he was in his 30s, but had the face of a man in his 40s or 50s. His skin, especially the skin on his palms, was rough like a farmer who worked in the fields. However, with just a glance, this Silver Moon Casino consecrator didn't walk towards the table where gambling was still going on. Instead, he walked towards another table where small bets were going on, sitting down across from a youngster. "Do you want to continue?" He looked at the young person in luxurious robes and asked him motionlessly. The young man smiled, and the middle-aged man with a slightly dark complexion who looked very plump on the other table stopped what he was doing. "How can you tell?" The young person looked with interest at the academician and asked. "You have no interest in gambling. The winning and losing here are small in your view, so you are not a gambler." This consecrator gave that stout middle-aged man a look, and then looked at a leisure person who wasn't far from this youngster, seemingly just here to watch the show. He said, "Your cultivation isn't high, but the attention of two powerful cultivators is always on you, so you should be the main target." The young person smiled. His smile was filled with satisfaction. "Wu Guang, someone's judgment of you is correct. In terms of intelligence and cultivation, you are nameless but real." The academician's eyebrows rose slightly. "How do you know my name?" The young person did not answer and said matter-of-factly, "I have enough tacticians around me, many cultivators, and even assassins and death warriors. But I lack a grandmaster like you who is strong enough to ensure my safety at any time." The two old shopkeepers in black robes exchanged a look and felt this was absurd. One of the thin, old men smiled warmly, but his voice was cold. "Little brother, do you know that in the past there was a leader in the streets of Chongling called Wang Taishu? He received the support of the warden's office and controlled almost all of the gambling houses and brothels in Chongling. But our Silver Moon gambling house is still outside his jurisdiction. I know that your Silver Moon gambling house is a lone wolf in Chongling and does proper business. But it doesn't matter. The reason why the Silver Moon Casino can be so successful is mostly because you have such a strong consecrator." The young person looked domineeringly at the old shopkeeper and said, "Most importantly, it depends on Mr. Wu's intentions." The old shopkeeper looked at this ignorant junior and sneered. "Since you know that my Silver Moon gambling house has someone like Mr. Wu, do you not know why Mr. Wu is here?" The young person looked back at the old man in disdain and said, "Of course I know that his mother is seriously ill and needs expensive medicine for many years. So he is here. Do you not understand kindness?" The old shopkeeper was angry. He was unwilling to speak to this young person and wanted to chase him out. "I am young and not in a hurry. You are so old. Why are you in such a hurry?" The young person looked even more disdainfully at the old shopkeeper. After a pause, he said, "Of course I understand kindness. But this Silver Moon gambling house is my property. Strictly speaking, all the expenses the Silver Moon gambling house has spent on him and the kindness I have shown him over the years are all mine. I am asking Mr. Wu to respect his opinion and see if he wants to stay here or follow me." As soon as these words came out of his mouth, the two black-robed old shopkeepers fell into a huge shock. The young person lost his patience. He took out a black rhinoceros horn token and placed it on the table in front of him. In the eyes of outsiders, and even other people in the gambling house, this Silver Moon gambling house naturally belonged to these two old people. But these two old people knew that they were just taking care of this gambling house for someone else. This gambling house had changed hands many times, but the person who had this token was the true owner of this gambling house. But they had not expected the owner of this gambling house to be such a young person. Wu Guang had been silent as he listened to the conversation between the shopkeeper and the young person. Only now did he take a deep breath and prepare to speak. "Actually, I do not want you to refuse because the matter is urgent. Only a cultivator like you can deal with it." The young person put away his smile and looked solemnly at him. He said, "It will be dangerous for you to follow me. But if you refuse, I will not force you. You stay here and help me take care of this gambling house. You are not hypocritical. Whether it is kindness or business, you have to make things clear first." Wu Guang nodded and looked at the young person. He said, "I will go with you." The young person stood up and bowed seriously to him. Then he put away the token that represented his identity as the owner of the Silver Moon gambling house and turned to leave. The two old shopkeepers panicked slightly. "Boss, please wait." It was the old shopkeeper who had spoken earlier who spoke. He hurriedly bowed and asked, "Just now, how did you win?" For these two old shopkeepers, this was the business they cared about. They really could not understand how the people under the boss could do something to the gambling house that could not be tampered with. Even more importantly, since it could be tampered with, then maybe in the future, someone could tamper with it. I like violent and direct methods the most. The gambling equipment cannot be tampered with, but the people can be bought. So in the future, if there are things you cannot understand, do not start with inanimate objects. Think from a different perspective, and think from people. The young person turned slightly and glanced at the two old shopkeepers and the dealer as he spoke. The two old shopkeepers' eyes widened in disbelief. This was a problem that he could not understand no matter how long he looked at it. It turned out that the previous few dealers had all been bribed by this young man. Was it all planned beforehand? How much would it cost to bribe these dealers who had not had problems for many years? This was indeed an overly violent and direct method. This young boss was not ordinary. "Who are you?" Wu Guang followed the young person out of the gambling house. Looking at the numerous carriages and the servants on the carriages, he could not help but ask curiously. The young person smiled faintly. "Xie Changxing." Wu Guang stilled. "Do not be surprised. My Xie family does not have such methods." The young person seemed to see through his thoughts and said, "This has nothing to do with my family. This Silver Moon gambling house is a property given to me by a friend." Wu Guang was still unable to speak. "Very powerful?" The young person was Xie Changxing. He still had an arrogant air as he smiled. "In terms of making friends and spending money, I am very powerful. If I say I am second, I fear no one can say they are first." Wu Guang took a deep breath. After following Xie Changxing into the carriage, he asked, "You already have so many powerful retainers and servants. There are not many people in Chongling who can compare to you, but you still came to find me. What is the urgent matter?" There was an assassination attempt, and the people involved were all important figures. Xie Changxing looked at the rain outside the carriage, and his expression grew serious. "I have a friend who cannot appear and needs my help." Chapter 548. The yellow-robed man who had an unpleasant conversation with Zheng Xiu walked out of the imperial palace. He walked slowly. Other than thinking, what happened in Chongling today was fated to happen, and he did not need to interfere. Regardless of Zheng Xiu's opinion, Today was Jiaodong Commandery officially stepping onto the stage of Chongling. Yuan Wu and the two ministers would not refuse. From a certain point of view, Jiaodong Commandery and Yuan Wu and the two ministers had the same interests. So in his view, some people were fated to die today. Some people's life and death were determined by the choices they made. In the morning light, a young cultivator who appeared to be full of vitality walked into a courtyard of the Fong Marquis establishment. This remote and cold courtyard had originally been Fong Xiumu's place of seclusion, and now it was Fong Xiang's place of recovery. Strangely, this young cultivator's face was similar to Fong Xiang, but Fong Xiang had never seen this young cultivator before. Sitting on a rattan chair, covered in a thick blanket, Fong Xiang's gaze moved away from the fish that had sunk to the bottom of the pond due to the cold. He slowly looked up. Without his permission, no one could enter this courtyard. While his cultivation had been crippled at the Deer Mountain Conference, and his hidden wounds were hard to heal, he was a general who had killed countless people before being made a marquis, and had countless loyal subordinates. To be able to walk in here so easily was not much different from attacking the depths of the great floating water prison. He narrowed his eyes slightly in the morning light. The sunlight turned half of his face golden. He did not speak, and looked silently at this young cultivator who looked similar to him. This young cultivator he had never seen before walked in front of him, and then knelt down. He said, "Father." This young cultivator had been extremely respectful since he walked into this courtyard. In all aspects, he was like a wanderer coming to see his father. But Fong Xiang knew he could not have a son like this. Chongling is a wondrous city. Anything can happen. Anything can be seen. Fong Xiang smiled emotionally. Then he looked at this young cultivator who was still kneeling on the ground and asked, "Who let you come?" "I am Li Xian." The young cultivator did not look up and said, "Starting from today, I am Fong Xian. It's actually Prime Minister Li's people." Fong Xiang frowned and did not hide his disdain. There are still people in the Fong family. Isn't he afraid that my brother will come back and kill him? This young cultivator called Li Xian seemed to know that Fong Shun would say something like this. He still said respectfully, "This is the situation," in return for not interfering in Jiaodong Commandery's matters. Fong Xiang fell silent. After a long time, he looked at Li Xian, who was still kneeling on the ground, and said, "What if I don't agree and don't want to have a son like you? Then I will kill you. Then I'll announce to the outside world that your injuries are too serious to be treated, and I'll still be your illegitimate child, the successor, and the person in charge of Fong Ho Province. The outcome of this matter will not change." Li Xian said without hesitation, "Of course, I don't want to see such a thing happen. It won't do us any good." After a pause, he raised his head, looked sincerely at Fong Xiang, and continued, "If you do not agree, many people who do not agree like you will die, and many people in Fong Ho Province who do not recognize my identity will also die. Since the outcome will not change, there is no meaning in this. Also, I am your son. You will live well, and Fong Ho Province will continue well." Fong Xiang laughed. "Do I not have to consider the thoughts of the other marquisate establishments?" Li Xian answered seriously, "You are recovering here, and not leading the army outside. So your news did not come quickly enough. The invasion of Chu in the spring will have enough military service, and a new marquis will be born. The 13 marquises of the Qin dynasty are cold without lips. The weak will disappear, and the strong will rise. This is a natural change. For most marquisate establishments, to ensure that the marquises of the Qin dynasty have enough power, one or two more is more important than one family changing." Fong Xiang did not look at him. His gaze landed on the frozen fish at the bottom of the pond again. He said slowly, "Since you have thought it through, what other opinions can I have?" Li Xian kowtowed again, and said without another word, "Father." Since ancient times, there had only been people who recognized the enemy as their father for power, but today, there was the matter of being forced to recognize a son. But Fong Xiang did not think about this ironic matter. As Li Xian stood up, he asked, "What does Jiaodong Commandery want to do?" Li Xian did not hesitate and said, "Xin Xian will die today." Fong Xiang sighed softly. The master of the great floating water prison was not important to Chongling. But the Secretariat Director, who was in charge of criminal law and convicted officials, was a new power. From any side's point of view, when the people around Zheng Xiu died one by one, and Zheng Xiu, who had no one to use Xin Xian naturally became Zheng Xiu's confidant, and one of the most important pieces. Jiaodong Commandery was not willing for Zheng Xiu's wings to be too full. The two ministers were not willing to see such a new power. The imperial family was not willing to see criminal law that could restrain royal power. Even the Li family back then could not withstand so much dislike and unwillingness, much less Xin Xian now. Xin Xian was a Realm 7 Grandmaster and had high cultivation. But this had nothing to do with cultivation. All of Chongling seemed to want Xin Xian to die. Then who could prevent him from dying? In the morning light, Xin Xian was drinking in the yard. Chongling's people usually drank tea in the morning. Only drunkards would impatiently pour a cup of wine at the start of the morning. Xin Xian was not a drunkard. He drank in the morning because he had been in the great floating water prison for a long time. His body had too much cold and damp energy, and drinking was beneficial to his energies. Also, an appropriate amount of wine could make his energies flow faster and his mind clearer. When he was in the great floating water prison, he never drank much less after he became the Secretariat Director. The Secretariat Director's compound was very close to the imperial city, but his residence was slightly further away. After the Empress gave him enough power, he naturally had the living arrangements of a major power in Chongling. At this time, his residence was comparable to the Prime Minister's. But ever since he took control of the great floating water prison, he was disliked by the nobility of Chongling, and even more so after he became the Secretariat Director. So while he had a residence, carriages, and horses, he was intentionally or unintentionally difficult in terms of using people. The people arranged for him to use were almost all mediocre people that the bureaus did not want, or even disdained. Even so, he still didn't have enough subordinates, not even enough. At this time, his residence was cold and cheerless. Only a carriage was waiting, and a yawning official was standing next to the carriage. He lacked people to purposely flatter and make arrangements. His residence took up a large area, but after a winter, it appeared slightly dispirited. There were not many fresh flowers and plants, and they were all yellow and gray. But Xin Xian, who was warming the wine and drinking by himself, did not care. For him, even the worst scenery outside was much better than the dark water prison in the great floating water prison. People who often dealt with death had extraordinary sensitivity to death. On this morning that seemed no different from the past, Xin Xian suddenly smelled the scent of death. A drop of blood appeared between the eyebrows of the official, who was still yawning by the side of the carriage, as if a red mole had grown out of his forehead. Then this official's breathing stopped. He maintained his yawning posture and died. A man in yellow robes appeared in front of him. Then he pushed open the half-closed door and walked into Xin Xian's residence. This man in yellow robes had a gentle face, slightly plump but not too fat. He looked friendly and amiable. But he had come to kill Xin Xian and casually killed an unrelated official. Any cultivator who was truly friendly would not do such a thing. Xin Xian drank all the remaining wine in the pot. When this unique yellow robe appeared in his sight, he had already stood up. He took a deep breath, his chest rising as though he wanted to suck in all the air and morning light in the courtyard. Xin Xian did not like to waste words, but his identity right now was the Secretariat Director. Therefore, after taking a deep breath, he looked at this yellow-robed man who had appeared in his line of sight and said, "I am sure that although that official is mediocre, he has definitely not committed any crimes. You also do not have any authority to execute him. Attacking and killing an official of the royal court is a capital offense." Hearing his words, the yellow-robed man smiled with interest. "So you mean you can convict me and have a reason to kill me? However, I came here to kill you, so who kills who depends on who can kill who. This is very important." Hearing his arrogant words, Xin Xian said coolly, "What is important is, as long as the laws are on my side, as long as you cannot kill me, I am still the Secretariat Director." The yellow-robed man smiled. The morning light between him and Shun Xian seemed to darken. Shun Xian shouted. His body suddenly floated to the left. A sword energy brushed past the right side of his neck and drew out a faint red line. This was an invisible sword energy that formed at a thought. Mind Chamber Sect. Shun Xian's figure was still a blur in the morning light, but his voice sounded. There was undisguised shock in his voice. This yellow-robed man was a powerful cultivator of Jiaodong Commandery, but what he used was the Mind Chamber Sect's mind-thought sword. The yellow-robed man had a teasing expression like a cat catching a mouse. He found it more interesting that Shun Xian could dodge this attack. You have good taste. He smiled mockingly and was not in a hurry to attack. He said, I am Zheng Bainiao, the second uncle of Empress Zheng Xiu. 17 years ago, I was a direct disciple of Mind Chamber Sect. Among the disciples of that generation, I was ninth according to the order of entry, but I left behind most of the cultivation records of Mind Chamber Sect. Shun Xian's figure stopped at this time. The afterimages around him disappeared, but the wind he created still flowed rapidly, causing his body to slowly appear in a layer of transparent mist. His face was much paler. He had no interest in Zheng Bainiao's cultivation history, but he knew that in these decades, there were only a few cultivators in Mind Chamber Sect who could comprehend the mind-thought sword and use it perfectly. These cultivators were all geniuses like Xin, who had participated in the Min Mountain Sword Trials. The strongest power of Mind Chamber Sect was the mind-thought sword. The most terrifying and difficult to defend against of the mind-thought sword was that it formed at a thought. It formed in the primal energies of the universe outside the opponent, and there was no distance between it and the opponent. For example, the sword that just now brushed past his neck was a sword that formed right next to his neck and cut into his body. Without distance, there was no time to react. Chapter 549. From a certain point of view, the heart-thought sword was the fastest flying sword method in the world. Other sects, even the flying sword methods that paid the most attention to speed, would always circle around the enemy. There would be some distance between the circles. If there was distance, there would be a flight path. If there was a path, there would be a head, tail, and start. It was easy to capture. The heart-thought sword of Mind Chamber Sect was formed with a thought. The sword energy would gather primal energies of the universe according to the will. This sword energy was transparent and formless and had no path to speak of. This sword was in front of him, but the next sword could come from behind. Unless Shun Xian could move at a high speed, then Zheng Bainiao would not be able to form invisible sword energies around him. However, moving at an extremely high speed would not only consume a large amount of vital essence, but the body was not like a flying sword. There was a great deal of inertia when moving. If one wanted to move smoothly and without a trace, so that Zheng Bainiao could not accurately grasp one's position, one could only do so with a few legendary footwork techniques that had long been lost. Even more importantly, Zheng Bainiao's vital energy cultivation was terrifying. Each flying sword he formed could be tangible and was no different from a powerful flying sword. The sword energies of young cultivators like Xin of Mind Chamber Sect would quickly dissipate. But when he formed his flying swords, even if they missed, they would still fly like real flying swords. So when he continuously attacked with all his power, the flying swords in front were still flying in the air, and the flying swords behind were forming. These flying swords that were constantly forming around Shun Xian, under the deliberate efforts of a cultivator of Zheng Bainiao's level, could form a sword net in a short time. He could not escape, could not get close, and could not use his sword to block. His body's reaction could not keep up with the speed of the other's thought sword. So since the Yu dynasty, countless cultivation places appeared and disappeared around Chongling. Yet, even though Mind Chamber Sect could not stand at the peak of a time like Min Mountain Sword Sect and Lingshu Sword Gate, because of the existence of such a powerful sword manual, they always had a place in Chongling. You can't escape, so there's no need to consider who's in the right. There's no need to consider whether you're still alive or not. Zheng Bainiao licked his lips with a hint of excitement. He said mockingly, "You are much more famous than me, but unfortunately, You are only a cultivator of the same realm as me. Shen Xian had spent most of his life in interrogation other than cultivation. He could get a lot of information from the other's words and expressions. Just like now. This powerful Jiaodong commandery cultivator called Zheng Bainyao was very proud. He had been repressed for a long time. He yearned to be recognized by the world. After all, for most cultivators, they wanted to leave their mark on the history books. But the most blatant message was that he was almost invincible in the same realm. Facing Zheng Bainyao's gaze, Shen Xian knew that Zheng Bainyao was so confident right now that he could win against cultivators like Zheng Xiao, who were second only to Yuan Wu. Shen Xian did not speak. He maintained his silence. When Zheng Bainyao's last words had not disappeared into the air, he took another deep breath. His face grew paler, and even his cheeks were so gray they were almost black. But in this moment, the surface of his body was filled with the pungent smell of blood. A thick layer of viscous blood was forced out of his body by this breath, seeping out from the countless pores on his skin, covering the surface of his body. Even his face was no exception. The dry leaves and dust in the courtyard seemed to be pulled over by his breath and fell on his body like moths. These withered leaves and dust adhered to his body, instantly forming a gray and decaying armor, making him look especially sinister and terrifying, filled with a terrifying and mournful aura. It was also at this moment that he began to flee to the back of his courtyard. At the same time, Zheng Bainyao's second attack had been launched. A transparent sword light with proud and powerful killing intent fell towards his left abdomen. There was a muffled sound. It was like a piece of stone smashing into a vat of paste. When the sword light touched the layer of blood on the surface of his body, it paused slightly. It only created a few splashes of blood and gray fragments before it slowed down. Then with a soft hum, Shen Xian flicked out a sword light and shattered this thought sword. The exchange in this instant was too fast, even faster than the speed of thought. Only when the energy from the shattering of the thought sword created beautiful white marks and whirlpools in the air, and Shen Xian smashed into the courtyard behind him, did Zheng Bainyao's eyes flash with shock. Shen Xian's armor made from blood, primal energies of the universe, and rotten things had a unique smell of decay. This was why his sword essence could not penetrate deeply. Such a secret technique seemed to be the legendary armor of decay. It was said that it could only be cultivated by absorbing the vitality of countless rotten bones. Wearing armor was undoubtedly a good way to block the heart-thought sword. Shen Xian's performance surprised him again, but he did not feel that this would change the final result. In his view, this was just drinking poison to quench one's thirst. With a soft sound, his feet tapped on the ground. His body created a long hole in the dust created by Shen Xian's escape. His speed was faster than Shen Xian's. But to ensure the advantage of the heart-thought sword, he deliberately maintained a distance of dozens of feet from Shen Xian. Shen Xian was not fleeing in the direction of the imperial palace, but towards the Wei River. It seemed that Shen Xian already knew. Since the people of Jiaodong Commandery had appeared here to kill him, then there was no meaning in him fleeing towards the Empress. Also, the people of Jiaodong Commandery would not let him charge into the imperial city. Shen Xian had been in the water prison before, and had fought with Bai Shan Shui and the others on the Wei River. He was better than most cultivators at using water to escape. But was this the right choice? Zheng Bainyao smiled scornfully. Two sword lights appeared in the dust and fell towards the back of Shen Xian, who was fleeing towards the Wei River. Two patches of gray dust rose from Shen Xian's back like two rotten wings. Most residences were not willing to be in the clear sight of the turrets. Shen Xian's residence was at the edge of a blind spot between two turrets. But in this alley, there was an upper-level room of an inn that could see half of Shen Xian's courtyard. Can you deal with it? Xie Chongqing looked at the battle through the window of this room and asked Wu Guang softly. There should be no problem in letting him escape. Wu Guang naturally knew who the two sides were, but he did not ask any extra questions and just answered softly. However, Xie Chongqing hesitated for a moment. Wu Guang said there should be no problem in letting Shen Xian escape, but did not say he could deal with it. This meant that Wu Guang did not have absolute confidence in winning against such a heart-thought sword. The price of letting Xin Xian escape may be that Wu Guang was left behind. Trading a life for a life, even if it was the life of this Jiaodong commandery expert, this was not the best choice for Xie Changxing. The plan has changed. Just as he was hesitating, a steady voice rang out. This voice came from a long-haired man in a wheelchair behind Xie Changxing. This long-haired man's legs were broken. You do not have to stop this person with the heart-thought sword. You only need to kill the pawns Jiaodong commandery placed along the way and the cultivators who were stopping Xin Xian's escape. The long-haired man looked at Wu Guang, who had turned around. Xie Changxing's eyes lit up. He asked before Wu Guang, "Why?" "Because we, like this Jiaodong commandery cultivator, have underestimated Xin Xian." The long-haired man looked at him and said, "True escape is completely different from his escape right now. If I am not wrong, he just wants to find a chance to throw off the companion of this Jiaodong commandery cultivator. He has the ability to kill this person alone, so we only need to kill the helpers that may appear around this Jiaodong commandery cultivator and create a chance for him to face this person alone." Xin Xian could defeat this person alone? This was clearly a mad escape. How could it be seen that this was not a true escape for his life? Xie Changxing was in disbelief, but he did not doubt the other's words. If that is the case, then do as Mr. says. He immediately glanced at Wu Guang beside him, as if a heavy burden had been lifted off his shoulders. Wu Guang did not question anything. Before walking out of the room, he bowed to the long-haired man and said, "Mister, your name?" The long-haired man grimaced slightly. "Some call me Sun Sick. Some call me Ghost Sunday." Wu Guang's body shook. "Master Wei Shangshi Guigu?" The long-haired man said self-mockingly. "Exiled when Wei was still here. Can I still be considered Master Wei?" Chapter 550. What do we do? A heavy voice sounded in the corner tower of Chongling, causing the copper bells hanging from the eaves to jingle. Multiple guards looked at Huang Jinwei, waiting for Huang Jinwei's answer. Xin Xian's courtyard was in one of the most difficult areas of the turrets to observe, but when grandmasters above Realm 7 fought, Xin Xian was passing through alleys, breaking through walls and tiles as he fled towards the Wei River. The rainwater in the wind and rain was like a serpent. How could he escape the sight of the guards on the turrets? Chongling had set up these giant turrets to detect powerful cultivators attacking in Chongling at the earliest time. This would make it easier to stop and kill the enemies of the Qin dynasty. Previously, the cultivators of Baishan Shui and the Zhao Sword Furnace had always been in awe of Chongling and were not willing to enter the city because of these turrets that could quickly detect their movements. If they attacked in Chongling, they had to quickly kill their way out of Chongling. Otherwise, they would not be able to leave. Every corner tower was equipped with powerful arcane artifacts. The guards were not weak cultivators. Xin Xian was an important official of the Qin dynasty. When he encountered an assassination, the turrets had the responsibility of protecting him. Also, after Mo Shouqing died, and the city guards were given to Huang Jinwei, Huang Jinwei and Xin Xian became the new leaders of Chongling. In the view of these guards loyal to Huang Jinwei, Xin Xian and Huang Jinwei were the new leaders that Zheng Xiu had raised and the present left and right arms. If the people from Jiaodong Commandery assassinated Xin Xian now, then they may assassinate Huang Jinwei next. This was the truth of the cold without the lips. But Huang Jinwei, who was silently looking at the mist dragon in the rain, heard the question and shook his head. He said, "Do not move." Why? None of the guards could understand. It was still the leading general who spoke and asked. Huang Jinwei said, "I am different from him. If Jiaodong Commandery kills him, the Holy One will not object, but the Holy One will not allow Jiaodong Commandery to kill me." These guards thought of what had happened at the Deer Mountain Conference and understood Huang Jinwei's meaning. "Is that all?" After a moment of silence, the leading general said, "His Majesty won't need someone forever, and he won't rely on someone forever." Huang Jinwei nodded. But even if you want to move, there will be a more appropriate time. Within the mist dragon, invisible swords were constantly being formed. These long swords continued to land on Shun Xian's body as he came out of the mist dragon. They didn't just create puffs of rotting dust behind him, they also created splashes of blood. Zheng Bainyao flew through the wind and rain with his hands behind his back. He was very satisfied. In the eyes of the cultivators who saw this scene, and in his perception, Shun Xian was like a dragon head, and he was the cultivator casually standing on the dragon's back. This dragon was undoubtedly powerful, but it was unable to resist his sword essence. The more casual he was, the stronger he appeared. Even more importantly, there would be countless cultivators in Chongling who would see this battle. Strength that the world knew was far more satisfying than feeling one's own strength. In a small river in the suburbs of Chongling, there was a small boat. A Taoist in indigo robe sat in the canopy of the boat. The river water rippled gently, and the boat brushed against the reeds. He was waiting for the mist dragon to charge out of Chongling and pass by here. It was still far away, so he had the leisure. Suddenly, this indigo-robed Taoist's expression changed. In his perception, a presence shot out of the sky like a burning meteor. It was more than twice as fast as the mist dragon fleeing out of Chongling. For example, when a cultivator attacked with a sword, no matter what realm they were, if they were too fast, they would not be able to follow up. But this meant that it was violent, and there was no room to maneuver. This indigo-robed Taoist, whose age could not be seen from his face, did not hesitate. He had no sword in his hand, but the sound of a sword being unsheathed came from inside his body. A white jade-like sword light lit up in his hand. The little boat he was sitting on immediately turned into countless pieces that flew out like butterflies. As he pointed his sword up, there was a rumble in the sky like a giant mountain sliding down. All the reeds in this part of the wild river were snapped. Driven by his sword, they shot up like thousands of arrows. These reeds had already withered in the winter. When they snapped, they were even more lifeless. Yet, as they moved through the air faster than the arrows, they rubbed against the primal energies of the universe he had attracted, creating heart-palpitating vitality and green. The primal energies of the universe that came like mountains caused these reeds to miraculously turn green. They seemed to grow rapidly in the soil and formed a green curtain in the air. At the same time, the jade-like life-bond sword in his hand gave off countless indigo sword lights that grew towards the sky like vines. There was an explosion. The cultivator falling from the sky shattered the green curtain and collided with the life-bond sword in his hand with a wild shockwave. This Taoist grunted. Half of his body smashed into the water below. Yet he managed to catch this terrifying blow, and with a swing, he sent the cultivator attacking from above flying back. There is no need to fight to the death with me. After using 2 rare secret arts to stop this person's attack, this Taoist's energies roiled. His body was numb. Yet, he forced himself to speak. He did not ask the identity of this person and shouted, "Regardless of your relationship to Shun Xian, you should know that I am not the only cultivator here to stop him. You have come like this and burned most of your vital energy. Even if you can kill me, can you escape?" Chun-Yi, you are He Chuan-Yi, the academician of the Li Marquisate establishment guarding Chongling. Wu Guang's figure was forcefully stabilized in the flying blue fragments. His clothes had been torn apart by the powerful primal energies of the universe, and were even more tattered than the clothes of a beggar. But the sword in his hand was exceptionally dazzling and extremely golden. He frowned as he looked at this Taoist with a cold expression and did not disguise his disdain. In the past, Marquisate Li sent his only son to the past to curry favor with the nobles. Now he is leaning towards Jiaodong Commandery. This is the Marquisate establishment with the least backbone of the 13 Marquisates of the Qin dynasty. The indigo-robed Taoist was the academician of the Li Marquisate establishment in Chongling, He Chuan-Yi. He was a grandmaster who had grown up with Marquisate Li in the military, and the strongest of the realm's 7 cultivators Marquisate Li had left in Chongling to guard the Marquisate establishment. Hearing the other's words, this Marquisate establishment academician's eyes burned with anger. He sneered. You think the other Marquisate establishments have backbone? If they did, Chongling would not be so quiet. Why should I wait here? Watching from the side is better than being an accomplice. Wu Guang stepped onto the water and held his sword across his chest. He looked at Yi Chuanyi and said solemnly, Please. In Chongling, this was an invitation to a duel. The corners of Yi Chuanyi's mouth twitched slightly. He did not hesitate and attacked with his sword. The water in his body flooded into the white jade long sword in his hand like a broken dam. But the sword essence coming off the white jade longsword was extremely gentle and had a unique harmony. The primal energies of the universe rumbled in the sky and landed far away, but quickly charged to his side from the ground. Hundreds of green sword lights spun around him, like vines interweaving together, densely weaving together. This sword strike of his was the intent of guarding. While he was a rare Realm 7 expert, today, he was just an unimportant pawn. In his view, even if he tangled with the other here, there would still be people who would stop Xinxian. The other had come here at the cost of burning most of his vital energy. He could not fight for a long time. No matter how one looked at it, it was the best choice for him to use his strongest defensive sword move to deal with it. But even more importantly, he had to be able to defend this attack. At the same time, Wu Guang had also attacked. When the green vine-like sword lights weaved into a cocoon and protected him in the center, he saw two golden lights fly out of Wu Guang's sword like two enormous wings. They grew larger and larger in his field of vision, instantly occupying all of his senses. They blocked out the sky and filled the entire world around him. The two enormous golden wings slapped down. There was a loud boom. The water in this wild river dried up. Then he, along with the sword light that wrapped around him, was pressed down into the ground. In a breath, he went down many feet. There is such a vast sword essence. Yi Chuanyi's expression changed dramatically. Just as this thought appeared in his mind, the sword light around him could not withstand the pressure and collapsed. The sword light collapsed, and then his body collapsed. Crack, crack, crack. His body exploded like a rock and smashed into the surrounding soil. Swan sword? Zheng Bainiao narrowed his eyes slightly, and his expression grew grave. Like many cultivators in Chongling, he saw the two enormous sword lights that looked like golden wings. Chapter 551. For Chongling, the swan sword was just a ripple from many years ago, the light of a shooting star. It was not the name of the sword or the name of the sword manual, just the unique mark of a grandmaster. Many grandmasters who came from far away encountered such an ending in Chongling. They only appeared in Chongling for a short moment, so the cultivators of Chongling knew very little about them. They did not even know their names, the swords they used, and the sword manuals they cultivated. The swan sword was like this. Even the most well-informed Jiaodong commandery only knew that this grandmaster came from Yangshan commandery. When he attacked, his sword light was like a swan soaring into the sky with a vast presence. In the past, the Shan clan had reformed with the support of the Bazin Kendo ground. Yangshan commandery had not been the first to implement it, but it was the first commandery to complete the reform. The reason for this was greatly related to the swan sword. Back then, when the old nobility of Yangshan commandery had been the most opposed to the reform, they had used iron and blood to suppress the land of a village and encountered the swan sword of the village. This previously unknown grandmaster had killed 2 Realm 7s and almost eradicated the power of the old nobility. At the time, this had caused a great shock in the Qin dynasty. Yangshan commandery became the first commandery to complete the reform, but like this grandmaster and the Shan clan, they did not have a good ending. After being defeated in the war against the Chu dynasty, Yangshan commandery was ceded to the Chu dynasty. Yangshan commandery, the first to complete the reform, had been ceded to the Chu dynasty. But after the Qin dynasty won the Deer Mountain Conference and the Yangshan commandery was taken back, no one investigated further whether or not this had any special meaning. But in the war against the Chu, Yangshan Commandery was to be governed by the Chu people. The Qin people of Yangshan Commandery were naturally unwilling. In the initial years, there had been many cases of suppression and resistance. That grandmaster whose sword was like a swan was recorded to have died in a battle against the suppression of the Chu people. For Chongling, more than a decade later, this was an old matter that few people knew about. Many people who heard it would feel that it was a fabricated story. But now, that grandmaster of Yangshan Commandery had clearly left behind an heir. That heir had appeared at this time, and his cultivation was likely no less than the grandmaster of Yangshan Commandery. But was it useful? Just like the grandmaster of Yangshan Commandery back then, when Yangshan Commandery was ceded to the Chu dynasty, he was destined to die. This was a true power struggle. A grandmaster like this was just a fleeting wave in the tide. Zheng Bainyao didn't think this would change anything. Therefore, his expression only turned serious for a moment because of the strength displayed by the two sword lights. After he understood the origin of the two sword lights, he could only shake his head in sympathy. Xin Xian was passing through the courtyard of an ordinary family. There were several orange trees planted in the courtyard of this ordinary family. The oranges on the trees were not all picked. Although they looked a little shriveled after a winter, they still had a pleasant color. Xin Xian quickly passed through these orange trees. The bright orange color seemed to dye his ashen face and added to his joy. His thoughts were completely different from Zheng Bainyao's. Only he knew that after becoming the Secretariat Director, he had gone to see Yi Sealing. Yi Sealing was the bureau chief of the Astrology Bureau. Strictly speaking, he was not one of the leaders of Chongling. But he knew that Yi Sealing did not just represent the Astrology Bureau, but the Bazin Kendo ground. Yi Sealing was like the person in charge of the Bazin Kendo ground in Chongling. Even if she could not act, she would have other ways to change the situation of certain death. Now, the sword light of the swan sword was the beginning in his view, a good sign. This was not a battle between him, a fledgling leader, and Jiaodong Commandery, but a game between all the new leaders of Chongling, the Bazin Kendo ground, and Jiaodong Commandery. On the turret, Huang Jinwei naturally did not know of the connection between him and Yi Sealing. But at this time, he had the same thoughts as Shun Xian about this battle. The higher one stood, the further one could see. He had taken over Mo Shouqing's position and was the eyes of Chongling. He was the person who saw the clearest in Chongling. In his perception, other than the two blinding sword lights, there were many powerful primal energies of the universe flowing in other places of Chongling. There was more than one battle between experts. The change had started. Also, the person who had the ability to mobilize so many powerful cultivators and completely affect this battle was fated to be a leader. So, silently, other than him and Shun Xian, Chongling had another new leader. And this new leader likely had more power than him and Shun Xian. Zheng Bainyao frowned slightly. The oncoming mist condensed on the tip of his eyebrows like sparkling dewdrops. The moment they formed, they were blown away by the wind and flew out from the side of his head. They were near the wilderness. They were very close to the patch of reeds where Hichuni had been waiting and not far from the Wei River. Hichuni had not appeared. This meant that even the strongest cultivator of the Li Marquisate establishment left in Chongling had been defeated by the Swan Sword. Other than Hichuni, the cultivators who should have taken Hichuni's place had not appeared. Who dares to interfere? His expression grew colder. The oncoming mist was unable to get close to his body and was pushed away by the vibrating energy on his body. An irregular and transparent ball of energy formed around him. The surface of the ball of energy kept on piercing out irregular long thorns. The tips of the thorns shone like starlight. They seemed to resonate with the ball of energy around him. Many stars lit up high in the sky. Xin Xian glanced up. He did not linger. In just a few dozen breaths, thick water vapor brushed against his face. They had reached the Wei River. The thick water vapor came from the rain hitting the surface of the turbulent river, splashing up even more water vapor. Unlike the clean rain falling from the sky, the water vapor from the Wei River carried a fishy smell, a smell he was more familiar with. Yi Sealing had returned from the Wei River in the storm, and he had escaped from Chongling in the rain at the end of winter and stepped into the cold river water. He stepped on the waves and walked to the center of the Wei River. The surroundings were vast. The mist and rain prevented him from seeing the banks of the Wei River. Then he stopped, turned around, and faced Zheng Bainyao, who was still chasing him. So the cultivation methods of Jiaodong Commandery are connected to the star energy. He looked at Zheng Bainyao and said with a strange expression, "It seems that it was not a coincidence that she approached the Bazin Kendo ground from the start." Zheng Bainyao found it hard to understand Shun Xian's expression right now. He said coolly, "There is no coincidence or certainty in the world, only one's own choice." After saying this, Zheng Bainyao had a disdainful expression. He turned his head slightly in the direction of the imperial city and said, "You are sitting in the position of Secretariat-Director because of her favor. But from the meaning of your words just now, you are not so loyal to her. It's ironic that the confidant she's nurtured is only so." Shun Xian shook his head and sneered at him. He said, "What you say is not correct. I am sitting in this position not because of her favor, but because of an exchange, just because of her needs." After a pause, Shun Xian looked in the direction of the imperial city and said, "If you are really her confidant, she would not have you appear in front of me to kill me today. Just like the people she was close to in the Bazin Kendo ground, I am just satisfying her needs for a moment. Since you know this, why struggle in pain?" Zheng Bainyao's clear emotions disappeared as he looked calmly at Shun Xian. Shun Xian's rotting armor slowly disappeared in the wash of the rain. What disappeared first were the dried leaves, branches, and dust stuck to the blood, and then the layer of sticky blood. Because of the great loss of blood, Shun Xian's body appeared cold and unusually pale, like a corpse that had been soaked in the Wei River for a long time. The Bazin Kendo ground is the same to her, and so am I. Jiaodong Commandery is the same to her. That was then, this is now. Shun Xian looked at Zheng Bainyao and said slowly, "The ones in control of Chongling are Yuanwu and her. If you want to survive in Chongling, either prove to be useful to Yuanwu or prove to be useful to her. Maybe the present Jiaodong Commandery is just a shackle to her." Some fresh sword essence appeared on Shun Xian's body. Just as this sword essence was released, the Wei River under his feet started to boil like hot porridge. Zheng Bainyao's eyes flashed. He inexplicably smelled a hint of danger. Shun Xian, who did not like to talk, said these words as though his only goal was to have the rotting armor on his body retreat. After it all retreated, his body could release energy better and summon the abundant water essence on the surface of the water. But what he could not understand was, without the protection of the rotting armor, how could Shun Xian stop his heart-thought sword? You think you are invincible in the same realm, but you do not understand. The reason I struggle in pain is because I am confident I can defeat you alone. You think you can shine like her once you appear, and continue to shine like this in Chongling. But like many experts who have come to Chongling, you are just a passerby. You're just a fallen leaf in this storm. Shun Xian's voice continued to sound. When the words leaf sounded, his sword essence was completely released, and his body was drowned in the wind and rain. The moment Shun Xian released his sword essence, the blood faded from Zheng Bainyao's face, and he became as pale as Shun Xian. What sword essence is this? He was naturally faster than Shun Xian, but as his thoughts moved, his mental power and the vital energy he released and the primal energies of the universe he summoned were all twisted and messed up by the wind and rain. The vital energy and primal energies of the universe that supported his thoughts, as they flowed towards Shun Xian, were blown around like a flying sword in the wind and rain. They slowed down as they moved around. It was like a flying sword that could appear directly next to the enemy, but now had to pass through the wind and rain, and float to the enemy's side like a leaf. All the advantages of the heart-thought sword no longer existed. In terms of using the sword, the heart-thought sword of Mind Chamber sect was defeated by Shun Xian's peerless wind and rain sword essence. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.